wish I could say that. Order, order. Could I call the committee to order this morning, and can I refer all those present to the register of members' interests where the interests of members are noted. This session of the committee is divided into two parts. The first part we will be dealing with our inquiry into knife crime, and on the second part we will be dealing with the policing process of leak inquiries when the Home Secretary will be giving evidence. Could I start with you, Detective Chief Superintendent? The problem of knives has been prevalent in Scotland for some time. What initiatives have the Scottish police enacted in order to deal with this, and how does this compare to what we are doing in England and Wales?
Good morning. Thanks for the invite along. Yes, we have had an issue in Scotland for decades, and we have come to the realisation that criminal justice is the service of last resort and not the service of first resort, and that would continue to fill prisons up. Strathclyde Police has a detection rate for murders at 97.8% over 30 years. Catching Category C murderers is not a particularly difficult thing to do. Preventing it is very difficult. So we try to look at it in an entirely different way, rather than look and wait until after the point of impact, but rather look and apply a public health notion that would look then at primary prevention issues. So rather than waiting and categorising knife crime separate from hate crime, separate from all of these things, that seemed to us to be like trying to tackle alcohol by looking at beer and then looking at whiskey and then looking at wine, but rather to look at what happened before that. So it's about that notion that it's preventable, that there are things that cause it. So if you were looking from a public health perspective and you use the analogy of TB, for instance, if you applied a criminal justice model to looking for a cure for TB, all you would do is wait until someone got TB, turned up, identified, put into a sanatorium, and if they survived, they would get out, and if they didn't, they wouldn't. And that seems to be what we have been doing, is that we've been isolating those people who are violent, but not treating them, and not inoculating those around them to make a difference. It's very long term. It's a generational change.
Is it on the increase in Scotland, or do you think you've contained it and it's starting to decrease?
Well, the Violence Reduction Unit was established in Strathclyde Police in 2005, tasked with looking at this. We took on a national responsibility in 2006. In Strathclyde, the serious assaults involving knives are down 15% on the 3-year average. Violence overall is down 9% across Scotland. In Strathclyde, it's 20%. So, but the truth of the matter is that there's a danger that we pick into statistics, and I think that's been part of the issue over the years, is that statistics will give you an indication of what we're doing. If we stop doing what we're doing right now, they would go back up again. So to say that a particular thing is responsible for a particular outcome, I'm afraid it's a little more complicated than that. And if we don't try to understand a bit more that landscape, then all we'll do is put more cops in the street and build more prisons and employ more lawyers and build more courts, and we'll still be you'll have another committee in 30 years' time discussing the same issues, because we won't have actually tackled it.
Presumably you have a lot of contact with Alfred Hitchcock, the government's anti-knife czar.
Yeah, I was at the Home Office strategic group last week, not far from here, about the tackling knife crimes, the action plan.
But did you know that he gave evidence to the committee last week, and unknown to the committee, we read in the newspaper today that he's about to retire from this post. Did you know that he was...
Absolutely no idea, no.
So it's come as a complete surprise to you?
I've no idea. I didn't know that, no.
I don't think it's got anything to do with his evidence to the committee.
Or indeed me, I have no responsibility for that.
Patrick Mercer.
Thank you. Detective Chief Superintendent, the VRU, you've touched on this already. The ethos and the methods of practice of the VRU, how does it differ from conventional police in terms of tackling violent crime?
Well, first of all, we recognise, in terms of the strategic plan that we have, which is 10 years, a 10-year Scottish plan, is that the role of criminal justice is to be as effective as it can possibly be. So you still need a robust criminal justice system, you still need the police to play their part. But it's understanding what that part is and what police can deliver for you. And what they can deliver is keeping a lid on it, containing and managing it, while we start to look at the other things. What we did was start to gather evidence and frame the problem from different angles. So we framed it from an economic angle, from a health angle, from education. And what we found with the very first graph that we pulled together, because there would have to be graphs if we have analysts and statistics involved in it, that when we looked at areas of high deprivation, that's where the victims of violence lived, that's where the offenders lived, and that's where most of the violence occurred. If we use that graph for public health, that's where the low birth weight babies were, that's where alcohol deaths were, that's where cancer-related and lung heart disease deaths were, that's where low aspirations for school were. It was exactly that. So we identified a shared client group. We identified a shared area where people were working, and everyone in their own way was doing something about that inequality in a different way. So what we tried to do was to find somewhere in that pyramid of delivery where we could say, let's make sure that we join this up, make sure that the national policy is joined up through that permafrost to the delivery policy at the front end. And so that was about understanding what an alcohol policy by health that would reduce the amount of alcohol in the street would help police immediately, because that would reduce. If we reduce the number of knives in the street, that would immediately help A&E consultants and orthopaedic surgeons. Because if someone's waiting to go in for a hip replacement on Monday morning and they can't go into that bed because somebody was assaulted on Friday or Saturday night, that's a secondary victim. That orthopaedic surgeon shouldn't be doing that. At Glasgow Dental Hospital, with maxillofacial surgeons, deal with a new serious facial injury every 6 hours, 365 days a year. The vast majority is a result of interpersonal violence, of varying seriousness. Now, 25% of those are repeat victims. So when we asked, what do you do for the repeat victims? Because if you went to your GP with a cold 3 times in a year, you would get some advice about exercise, you would get some advice about diet, and perhaps drinking, you almost get some advice about drinking, but nothing was being done. So now we've introduced something that was getting used in Cardiff, and Mary McMurran, a psychologist, I think she's now in Nottingham, a brief motivational intervention. That teachable moment when a young man is getting his stitches out and a nurse suggests to him perhaps he needs to think about alcohol, he needs to think about risk, he needs to think about anger, he needs to think about how he looks after himself. And so we've started to do that. Now, nurses deliver that.
Thank you. Gwyn Prosser.
Can you tell us, Superintendent, a bit more about the 2006 sentencing guidelines, the way you use them, the most effective part of that, and what effect they've had on carrying of knives?
Well, one of the things that we did to start with is we put a marker on everyone who was stopped carrying a knife or caught carrying a knife, and we tracked that through the system. So we found, for instance, that it was taking us a long time in the police to report that case sometimes, and so we speeded up our system. Sometimes when it went to the Procurator Fiscal, there would be no proceedings taken, so we challenged that. And what we started to do was say, look, carrying a knife is using a knife. You must presume that. You cannot wait until someone uses a knife. That's behaviour that when they use it as a happenstance. If they've got it in their pocket, they will use it. It has to be treated like that. And so we spoke to the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office, and we had their guidelines changed, so that if you were caught carrying a knife, you would be arrested, you would be fingerprinted, photographed and DNA'd, you'd be kept in custody until court. We would oppose bail. If bail was granted, we would ask for conditions, which might include an exclusion from a particular area. It might include being at your home, a curfew between 6 at night and 6 in the morning. We police that hard. If you're caught a second time with a knife, in Scotland it's called petition or indictment, which means you'll go to a sheriff and jury. You're kept in custody. And in Scotland, the rules under the prevention of undue delay is you can be kept in custody for up to 110 days. We did that. And what happened is those that were in custody have increased to between 400 and 500 in the prison service as a result of that. Now, if you've taken 400 or 500 violent young men and put them in there, then if they're not in the street, they won't be violent for that time. So it has made an effect. I cannot give you definitive evidence if it has actually deterred people carrying knives. I'm not absolutely convinced that it has, because young people are invincible. They're very difficult to reach and communicate with, and we need to be better at that. And when they do speak to us...
We'll be coming on to some of those points a little later, Chief Superintendent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Prosser. Tom Brake.
Just on that point, I wonder whether you know whether the 400 or 500 men who've been taken out of the system are actually getting the intervention that's needed while they're in prison. Because we've heard from other witnesses that it's pointless putting people away for 6 months.
No, the short answer is absolutely not. This year there's a new prison opened in Addywell in West Lothian, which services Lanarkshire, which is quite a busy area for us. And we've sponsored, the government sponsored, an intervention programme there called COVID, which is control of violent, aggressive, impulsive drinking, and we'll do 100 young prisoners. There is a violence programme in Scotland, which is the gold standard. It's a CBT, a cognitive behavioural therapy programme. But it's I think it's 200 hours long, very limited places. Pullman, which is a young offenders prison, their target is to deal with, I think, between 8 and 10 young men on that programme. There are 700 young men there, and 70% are there for non-sexual violent crimes. So it's a drop in the ocean. So when we speak about mandatory sentencing, we should be thinking about mandatory intervention. That would be much more effective.
So clearly at the moment the interventions aren't there.
They are not there. No, absolutely not.
Can I just come on to the Violence Reduction Unit? When it was set up in 2005, were there precise targets that the unit was seeking to meet? And if there weren't, how do you measure whether you're being successful or not?
Well, that was the first issue. We were told to find a way of thinking a different way, to go out there, and the Chief Constable at the time was Sir Willie Ray, and we called him Nike because he just said, just do it. If you think that's the way to go, just do it. And I think it's important that we didn't set off on a journey blindly. We researched, we had background, and had a general idea of where we were going. So when we were asked if we had a map, no we don't, but we have a compass. And that makes it much clearer for everyone to understand the direction they're going in, because services are all set up in different ways. And if we start to get entangled, that sometimes KPIs and set performance indicators within different agencies actually inhibit working together. Because if that's what you need to do, and that's why you're there, and that's what you've been measured on, why would you do something else? So actually, it mitigates against good partnership working. We have, for instance, the classic example is we have offender services set up different from victim services. If two young men in an estate leave the house tonight and they get into a fight, what decides who the victim is and what decides who the offender is? It's who's best, who the police catch or who they don't catch. And the truth of the matter is, if we think it's about the behaviour that led to that moment, because the outcome is a happenstance. And so some of the ways we measure, there are some quantitative ways. How many people do we speak to in terms of attitudinal change? We spoke to newspaper editors. And I think it was interesting. There's been a few things, but interesting, just last week, there was a headline in one of the Scottish papers that said a young man had been found guilty and sentenced to 15 years for a murder involving a knife. But the headline actually mentioned that this young man had been born to a drug-addicted mother in an abusive relationship. So the newspapers are now starting to put some context into, that's not excusing the murder that happened, but rather trying to understand in relation to, if we want to change these things, it's about primary prevention, it's about those early years, otherwise forget it, you'll need more cops.
Finally, clearly you've achieved quite a significant reduction in crime. I think you mentioned 20%. Longer term, do you think that sort of reduction is achievable, or is it going to plateau out at some point?
I actually want to increase the amount of violence that's reported to us. I'd like to see it going through the roof. Because right now, only 30% of those who turn up at an A&E department, and it's the same in England, will report it to the police. So you're judging us on 30% knowledge. So whether it goes up or down is an absolute irrelevance. It's a measure of activity. Because what will happen then, if you live in an area where there's loads of violence, and you see it outside your front window, you will know someone who's in prison, you will know someone who's been a victim, and the chief officer stands up, or a politician, and says, relax, violence is going down. You look out your front window and know that it's not your experience. So two things. Either that person's telling lies or that person doesn't know. Either way, it's not good for confidence, it's not good for confidence and well-being in the community. So I'd like to see it actually going through the roof. And we do have some surveillance involved now in hospitals, so we get more data from them, so we can get a better idea of the whole number.
Thank you.
Can you tell me something of the impact of alcohol on knife crime? The availability of alcohol, especially to young people?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think, as I alluded to at the start, that in relation to knife crime, we don't use the word crime with a violence reduction unit. Violence is everything. It only becomes a crime when it's reported to us. The second thing is that alcohol affects all violence. Over 70% of murders, alcohol is involved. Over 70% of domestic abuse incidents, alcohol is involved. Alcohol has been the elephant in the room. We have been mesmerised by heroin and cocaine, and it's absolutely right that we take due attention to that. But the truth of the matter is, alcohol is the elephant in the room. And there is research that's profound from all around the world. If you reduce access to alcohol, you will reduce violence. Now, whether you reduce that access by licensing laws, by price, by availability, by enforcement of legislation, you reduce it, you will reduce violence. No mistake about it.
Thank you. Janet Dean.
Can you tell us a little about the work that you're doing in primary schools and what's the scale of the prevention interventions that you're undertaking and the cost implications of that?
We have campus police officers who are dedicated community officers who work in schools. They start at the school, they finish at the school, they work with a head teacher, and there's a few things happen around that. We've got about 50 odd now in Scotland, because we view schools as a venue for education. A good community officer will bump into young people, maybe 30 or 40, during his 8-hour shift or her 8-hour shift, often in conflict situations. In a school, they'll bump into the whole school. They will be there. They're positive role models within the school. We've found that attendance in the school improves, bullying drops, school attendance, teacher attendance often improves, graffiti goes down. We find a way of dealing with the drama before it becomes a crisis. Because relationships are established, these officers are able to share information about individual boys and girls in the school that otherwise they wouldn't. For instance, if a young girl's dad is arrested for wife assault or domestic abuse on a Friday or Saturday night, then if she's not at school on the Monday, perhaps it's important that the school are aware of that. Perhaps it's important in terms of truancy to do joint visits. Those officers as well also link into the feeder primary schools and the nursery schools. But the primary schools, so that when that difficult time of transition, when young people walk into the big school, at least there'll be one face that they know, and it will be that police officer. We're currently doing Mori are doing an evaluation for us of the schools just now, which will be out in March. But some of the emerging issues for that are quite hopeful. The arrangements we have locally, it's down to autonomous divisional commanders or BCU commanders. Normally it's shared 50-50. The cost of a constable is 50-50. So it's maybe £25,000 for education per school, £25,000 for the police. It's a good investment.
So that 50 are in the high schools, are they?
Yes.
And then they work with the...
They work with the feeder primary schools. They work with that school community, because the high school will have feeder primary schools. They work within that community, and also any nursery schools that may be there. But in terms of primary prevention, we actually need to be further upstream. Not the police, but we need to be further upstream. We need to, I would suggest, build fewer universities and spend more on nursery teachers, and not national car parks for kids, but enriched, good quality education for under threes.
Thank you, Janet. Margaret Moran.
In Luton, we're developing a toolkit for alcohol reduction, but the young people are devising that themselves. How far are the young people involved in any of your programmes in devising your...
We work closely with Catherine Marshall, who's the Children's Commissioner, Children First, Action for Children. This year we have... We called it a youth engagement strategy, which is it's only an adult that could think of a title like that, but really what that's about is actually listening to young people, linking into the 32 local authorities in Scotland and saying, what are you asking your young people? Can you give us the information that comes from that? Can we put some questions onto that? Because I think that's the absolute key. Because when young people want to be safe, they want to be happy, they want to be with their friends, they want something to do, rather than I think what we all want to do. And I think we need to recognise that services for young people are as much our right as services for babies or services for adults or whatever. So we need to link more. We're not doing enough of that. We need to do much more of it.
Thank you, Margaret Moran. Bob Russell.
Thank you. I've been very impressed with what I've read about the Violence Reduction Unit and your evidence here today. And following on from colleagues where you've made reference to other agencies and the fact that the police are getting involved at the lower end rather than wait until the consequences. Could I just ask specifically in connection with that, how has adopting a public health approach to violence reduction improved, if it has improved, data sharing and partnership working between the various authorities at all levels?
Yeah. Well, first of all, by adopting a public health approach applies a few things to us. One, we need to understand the scale of the problem. We have a whole new lexicon of language. We start to think about protection and risk. We start not to think in years but in generations and what we need to do. We think of primary prevention and the effect. And when we start to use that language, that shared agenda becomes inclusive for other partners, because doctors can understand what we're speaking about, teachers can understand what we're speaking about. So we're not speaking about crime and offending and jail, and we're speaking about a common language. And that's the first thing. What we found, our keenest allies, because at the start we had a coalition of the willing, because we weren't mandated to do anything, and as a police officer for 34 years, I actually thought that people would do the right thing because it was the right thing. But anyway, that seemed to be a naive hope. But A&E consultants were the very, very first to walk towards the light and say, because they were passive receivers of the wounded, and they understood they had little control over how they could break out of that cycle. So they were very helpful. So we went to Cardiff, where Professor Jonathan Shepherd has done a fabulous job, and we actually stole some of his ideas. And there is a survey form which asks 10 questions, which clinicians fill in. It's anonymised. Where did it happen? When did it happen? What age are you? Male or female? Was there a weapon used? And other ones. We include, for instance, sectarianism as a question of gangs and things. That information is then matched with what we know, and we get a clearer picture of what's there. That's how we know only 30%.
How widespread is that A&E 10-point question form?
Well, in paper form, it's in almost every A&E. It's certainly in Strathclyde, but it's difficult with the paper form because we still only get a return of maybe 60 or 70%. We have in Lanarkshire Health Board, which will be kicking off in, I think, the beginning of next month, an electronic system where we actually merge the data. And we have an analyst, and the analyst will merge the data, and she'll feed that information into the local police task and coordinating.
But that's still voluntary. That's not a requirement, is it?
Well, no, we have that from the Chief Medical Officer in Health. Yeah, they're bought into that. That's not down to local doctors. This is on the EDIS, the system supported by the government. This is a proof of concept. Once it works, we'll have it rolled out throughout Scotland, and that will feed into the task and the coordinating process.
I was wondering whether you could send us a copy of that form, because I'm not sure it's nationwide.
Well, I can say Jonathan Shepherd, the professor, was actually chair of the CDRP in Wales a number of years ago, and by this method reduced violence in Cardiff by, I think, 40%. So
if you could send that to the committee,
it
would be extremely helpful. Thank you, Mr. Russell. Martin Salter.
Thanks very much, Chief Superintendent. We just want to probe a little bit about the meeting you held on the 24th of October at Glasgow Sheriff Court, which appeared to follow on the very successful Boston initiative for bringing gangs together, getting them face-to-face with A&E consultants and members of the community and victims, almost based, I think, on a kind of restorative justice model, but in a much kind of wider format. I mean, how effective has that been? And is there not a danger that, whilst on the one hand the figures we've seen seem to indicate a significant drop in subsequent instances of violence, isn't there a kind of danger that you may entrench that gang identity even further by almost institutionalising it as a result of adopting that approach?
Okay. Well, first of all, in relation to the gangs, we've had the gangs in Glasgow with the same names in the same territories for 30 or 40 years. It's already entrenched. So the do no harm notion was easy to deal with. The Boston project, my deputy Karen McCluskey came back having met David Kennedy at Harvard, who had started this, and had said to me, this is what you do. You get the young people who are involved in gangs and you tell them to stop doing it because you've had enough, and you offer them something else to do. I said, okay, and he said, that's it. And basically that's it. But what we did is, through intelligence, we identified all the gangs. And every police force will have this capability, to identify the gangs, who's in them, where they fight, what age, a whole range of things. We gathered that information, photographs, everything. We then visited them and chapped their doors. Said, listen, you want to be stopping doing this because the world's about to change in the East End of Glasgow, so perhaps you should come along to the Sheriff Court on the 24th of October. I should say I'm really making it very short, because we spent 6 months getting all the services together and selling the idea, but there were some very willing partners in that. So at the Sheriff Court we invited along 220 young men, 150-something turned up, 95 in the morning who were under 16 or under 18 but under supervision. We sat them in the public area of the court. We had police officers there. On the other side of the court we had about 80 professionals, teachers, social workers, voluntary workers, community workers, all in that end of the court. The sheriff, the judge came onto the bench and the court was called into session and everybody stood up and they were there. He welcomed them and then we gave them a series of inputs from speakers, no longer than 4 minutes each. Chief Constable was first to speak and when he spoke he walked amongst them and he said, we've had enough of this. The communities in the East End of Glasgow have had enough of this. And while he was speaking, in screens we showed the photographs of the gangs. We showed the photographs of the connections and where they fought. We told them, we know where you are, we know where you live, we know what you do, we know when you do it, and we're coming to get you. There are 8,000 of us, and if we need to be there every night of the week for the next 12 months, we will be there. We will make your life very difficult. We spoke about opposing bail and a whole range of things. Then we had a group called Medics Against Violence, who are all consultants who go into schools and speak about the damage that violence does, a newly formed group. They spoke to them about the damage that knives in particular do, that it takes an average 10 minutes for an ambulance to reach you, but you bleed to death in 8 minutes, and some profound pictures that went with that. I spoke to them about how difficult it must be from experience living in an area where you don't know if you're going to get chased when you leave the house at night, when you can't go and visit a girlfriend because she lives 2 streets away and that there is a gang in there, how it inhibits what you do, that we understood that. We had the local minister speak about burying young men. We had gang members speak. We had a mother whose son had a dreadful beating there speaking about that. We had voluntary groups. We had a young man who plays for the basketball team from Chicago who was a member of the Crips and his brother died there and he spoke, very powerful. We had 2 life coaches who were ex-offenders who were really the most telling. And one of them said that he met a man in prison that when he was 19 he tried to kill because he came from a different street. And he became friends in prison. And when he went to his mother's funeral and he was standing at the side of the grave, it dawned on him that in all his 31 years or 28 years, he'd never bought his mother a Mother's Day card. Young men linked to their mums. That really got to them. And then we finished with a guy called Jack Black, who runs an organisation called Mind Store, which is a self-help motivation. Big guy. If you want a 2-day session with him, it'll cost you £1,500. He came along for nothing because I know him and he was a social worker in Easterhouse, so we called in a favour. He came along and spoke to them and said, what I want you to do is, you've all been given a card with a phone number on it. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. He said, all these people here are here because they care about you. If you don't care about yourself, we do. We've had enough. We don't want this anymore. You've had enough. We want to tell you there's another way of doing things. He said, so I'm going to ask you a question. Only the bravest among you will stand up because the other ones won't. And he used some quite colourful language around that. And when he said, right, stand up, first of all, 10 stood up, and then maybe 15, then 20. Every one of them stood up except 3. And as they were standing up, the professionals started to applaud, spontaneously applaud. In the afternoon we had 55 adults in. They all stood up. We had 6 young men in from Pullman Prison who were in the dock with prison officers. They wouldn't leave until they'd been given a card with a phone number on it. They've already been on the phone saying, I get out in 7 months, will this still be here? And it will be. Within the first 4 weeks we had 70 contacted us, and they are now into programmes. Because what happens is they phone a free phone number, it's manned 24 hours a day. It's a no wrong door. It might be about education, it might be about readiness for work, it might be about alcohol counselling, drug counselling, it might be housing, it could be a whole range of things. We've also set up a football tournament with about 160 involved in it, and yesterday morning my DCI, who's a project manager, received a phone call from the sub-divisional officer who said, I'm just phoning you, Andy, to let you know I had no disturbance calls in Easterhouse over the weekend because the football was on. 160. So we know what works. Everybody here knows what works. It's our ability to deliver it consistently that's the challenge. It's our issue. It's not their issue.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite inspirational. Very, very simple question and a quick answer because I know the chairman needs to move on. Are you going to be doing more of this? And should this be rolled out across the UK nationally? And should it form a basis of our recommendation in this committee?
This is not a pilot. It's not an initiative. This is about changing the way we do our business. So this is getting embedded. We're not doing this and walking away. We've got funding committed to this for 2 years, and we've got other funding planned for after that. It will roll out across Glasgow, and then we'll pick out, we're creating a learning network, because not every city has the gangs issues, you know, but there'll be things that we find out about information sharing, which are really good, that will help other people. So I think there'll be elements of it, and we've already done that. We already ran a workshop down in the Met just last week for some of the Detective Chief Superintendent Ball organised. So there'll be things that others can judge what's best to do from that. But we're not going to wait. It's the right thing to do. We won't have the stats next year. We won't have the stats in 2 years. It's the right thing to do. There'll be some indicators, but we need to stay in.
Many thanks. Thank you, Chairman.
Executive Chief Superintendent, we, I think, all are very impressed with what you have said to the committee today. It sounds extremely practical, which is what we're looking for in respect to this report. Now that Mr Hitchcock has given up his job, maybe you should apply.
No, I'm sorry, 34 years, I know. Scotland's difficult enough.
But if you could send us that written information
yes.
that Mr Russell asked for, that would be very helpful. And it may well be that some members of the committee may come and visit your project in Scotland
very well
to see what you're doing there. Yes. Certainly if you hold another day such as the one you described, we would like to come and see.
20th of February is the next one, so if you have a date. We'll have other ones, regular ones.
We're very impressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Order. Could I call to the dais Mrs Oakes-Odger and Ian Levy? Mrs Oakes-Odger, if I could begin with you, we'll come to Mr Levy in a second. You're the mother of Wesley, who was killed in Colchester on the 12th of September 2005 at the very young age of 27. He challenged a man who pushed in front of him at an ATM queue, who later returned with his brother, and Wesley was stabbed in the neck and he died.
That's correct. 2
people were subsequently found guilty of manslaughter and murder. After this horrific attack, you set up your own anti-knife resource, and you now work in partnership with the police and other organisations. On behalf of the whole committee, of course, we express our deep condolences at the loss of your son at such a very, very young age, and we commend you on the work that you're doing. In the work that you are doing with schools and school children, can you tell the committee anything about the attitudes which lead young people to carry knives?
I think the biggest contributing factor to young people carrying knives is firstly ignorance, and alongside that fear. Throughout young people's years coming through their school education, we know that young people experience a certain amount of bullying and peer pressure. And often those people that have experienced that bullying go on sometimes to become bullying themselves. And personally, from the work that I've been doing, I feel that those particular children run the serious risk of being those that can become involved in crime. They are potentially the ones that will be affected by fear and carrying a knife. And we all know that within an altercation, a knife potentially is that serious killing weapon. During the time of going into the schools and speaking mainly to 11 and 12-year-olds, that's Year 7, first year senior school, what actually comes out of speaking to those young people is they have no real understanding of what death means. They understand that when a family member dies, they're usually older, they're usually grandparents or aunties and uncles, and when they die, they don't see them anymore. But in terms of death, that has no relevance to them as people. At 11 and 12 years old, they're never going to get old. Almost older people are another species, and death is something that happens to everyone else. So within talking to those young people, I speak to them about what happened to Wesley. I show them Wesley through their growing up years so that they relate to Wesley as being someone within their age field, and then the understanding comes out of his story, what relevance that is to them going through their school years. I speak to them about their discos and things, their social events, where an innocent situation can evolve, and if you have a knife, instead of a possible disagreement where bumps and bruises are involved, with a knife in their pocket potentially, therein is a life-threatening situation which they then relate to only in terms of missing fingers. I find that showing young people pictures of injuries that they can relate to, such as fingers hanging off, has more relevance to them. I would also concur with the previous evidence that we've heard today, that looking at the issue as a health issue allows us to proceed down the road of more prevention.
Thank you. Karen Buck.
Thank you. Yeah, Richard is very powerful. And I just wanted to ask you, on the basis of your experience, and also judging from the feedback you're getting from the young people that you've worked with, what is the right balance between the story you tell them that allows them to engage with the young person who's lost his life, the shock tactic approach, maybe the approach that has taken young people into youth offending institutes and prisons to actually talk to people who've been convicted? What is the right balance? What gets through to people? Or is it actually that we do have to have that continuum of all of those different approaches?
I think we need all of those different approaches, but certainly from my experience of working not just within Essex schools, within London schools, Leeds, Manchester, as far up as Cleveland, we know that different counties have different dialects that they speak about. But the bottom line is young people all have a simplicity of what they need. They need safety, they need to feel safe. And the right balance when speaking to young people is I relate with them about Wesley's story as a mum, so that they can think about how would I feel if my brother or sister was missing and my mother was hurting at the loss of my brother or sister.
I think that, I'm tremendously supportive of that approach. I think it is so very powerful. But given what we know about young people, the fact that they all believe they're invincible and their risk assessment is poor, they always think that even if this is true and shocking, it isn't going to happen to them. Should we perhaps not concentrate much more just on the simple practicalities about anger management and how you stop people, how you teach young people to back down in conflict situations, rather than perhaps dealing with the consequences of an event that they are convinced is never going to happen to them?
Well, I think we need not just to look at the issue of knives, we need to get through to them on a level they can understand, and show them the consequences of becoming involved in the whole cocktail that is influential in becoming involved in crime. Looking at if they, during their school period, their school day, act in an antisocial way and become excluded from school, what those real consequences are of becoming involved with other people that are acting in an antisocial way and excluded from school. Often, by joining together, it's perpetrating a cycle where abuses can then come into the frame, such as alcohol. And on that point, I think that the committee can perhaps look at the issue of alcohol pops where young people are concerned. We have to look at not just knife crime and the consequences with young people, but the whole cocktail. And by explaining that in terms that young people understand and supporting that with the Safer Schools police officer, within the teaching forum, bringing the parents within that situation, and having an ongoing programme. It can't just be, well, let's have a talk in school once or maybe twice. It has to be a network of teachers, parents being engaged within that, police. We have to try and get across to young people that respect alongside consequences, respect for themselves and respect for authority.
Thank you. Gwyn Prosser.
I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about your road shows. You know, you've got a powerful message to give to these children, but unless you engage with them and they're enthusiastic about listening to you, then not much is obtained. How would you actually engage with them? And is the feedback that they are listening and the message is getting across, or otherwise?
Well, there was a number of reasons why the roadshows are very successful. Initially, the very first talk that I did in a school in Essex was in January 2007. And at that time, we found a huge resistance within schools. The actual head teachers were very concerned about having a weapons awareness programme within their school, because they felt, or they were concerned, that it might suggest to the local community that their school had a problem. And how to address that was to say, how can we engage not just the children, but the head teachers, the schools, how can we get everyone behind that situation? By expanding the roadshow from what was previously a very successful 11-year project looking at drugs and alcohol, by expanding that to look at bullying, which covers their growing years, and young people can relate to that issue, by bringing in a stage production of an altercation that could possibly happen to any young person, and bringing those children within the audience up onto stage at the various different parts of the show to engage within that show. We then opened up not just the school attitude and making that change to having weapons awareness, but we opened up the thought pattern of those young people actually viewing the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Davis.
Mr. Oakes-Odger, you've expressed concern in the past that people convicted or found carrying knives are treated less severely than those found with firearms, which I think I would sympathise with. Do you think that the recent changes to the laws, the tightening up and the increasing sentences have helped? And are you happy with the general direction the government's now taking on this?
I was very pleased with the result at the bill stage of the Violent Crime Reduction Act, wherein people found carrying a knife, the penalty was increased from 2 years to 4 years. I feel that at that level, that is a reasonable penalty and brings it reasonably in line with gun crime.
Do you not have a concern, though, that whilst the maximum penalty is there, it's very rarely applied?
Yes, I have a very real concern of that, and I have asked the question before. In fact, at the first Home Affairs Select Committee, the single session that took place in March 2007, at what point and under what circumstances does the magistrate refer that incident onto Crown under the so serious basis for a penalty?
And lastly, do you think that police have got adequate powers of stop and search to deal with knife crime?
I'm very pleased with the fact that we now have a strategy in place for stop and search. This is about protecting those that don't carry knives. And on the issue of sentencing, I would like to say that I feel that whilst we have a sensible sentencing situation on what I call the lower end, those where we're looking at young people carrying knives, we are in danger of forgetting that alongside prevention, dealing with those young people carrying knives that we do not want to criminalise, we do have another sector of society. We have a nighttime economy that involves alcohol and the older people. We have a serious age group in their 20s and 30s that are parents themselves. It is those people that have quite often been responsible for taking life. The two brothers responsible for my son's death were actually 31 and 36. And therein, I feel that we must and we still need to look at the sentencing strategy there, because if somebody takes a knife that has a previous history of violence and using weapons, takes that knife and thrusts that knife in a person's neck or in their chest, they are acting in a way that is more likely to kill than not. And therefore, when we look at somebody taking a gun with that same background, often we are seeing a life sentence with a tariff sometimes as much as 10 years apart from that same incident involving a knife. And I personally feel that we need to look at closing that gap.
Thank you. Patrick Mercer.
Mrs. Oakes-Odger, the amount of coverage that knife crime got, particularly towards the end of last year, do you think that was helpful in terms of deterring this form of violence, or might counterintuitively it have caused more people to carry edged weapons?
I would agree with you on both points, but at the time that Wesley's life was taken in 2005, we had a huge focus on gun crime, and rightly so. Often we had serious loss of life of all ages, of people being stabbed to death, and it would come up in the media focus and slide away again. We needed to have that focus to arrive at the situation that we have here today. And the media can work very much to the good of a situation, and what we are doing by discussing this issue today is saying we are at that point where addressing the problem is prudent and necessary. We also, I would comment, as far as the media is concerned, we had a very successful Home Office engaged media focus during the summer months, where other organisations, other community-based organisations, which is very important to work alongside the police and generally within the community, it's necessary to have those stories out within the media. So that is a prime example of using the media for positive situations.
Thank you. Janet Dean is the final question.
Thank you, Chairman. Aside from action around education and penalties, which we've talked about, what else would you like the government to do to tackle knife crime?
Well, I would like to see the work that Essex has been doing since the campaign that I personally worked on in 2007. That has proved very successful. The 2008 roadshow covering bullying, drugs, alcohol and knives, the feedback that we've had from that has been hugely positive. This year's 2009 programme, we have more and more schools signing up to come and see that show. We actually engaged 15,000 Year 7s in Essex last year, and that number is greatly increased so far in the 2009 programme. The follow-up to those roadshows is engagements within the schools alongside the Safer Schools officers. And the roadshow is not the only Essex-based project that we're doing. We have the SOS bus that works within the nighttime economy with the older youngsters, teenagers. I would personally like to see the government roll out a system like that, if not that particular system. Certainly I'd like to see many more community organisations using those families like myself, and I'm not unique in this, those families that can come out and speak to young people in a positive way. I would like to see more families be involved in that. But a national education programme so that all Year 7s at the latest have the ability to access weapons awareness programs.
Thank you. Your local MP is here, obviously, Mr. Russell.
Yes.
We can't not let him ask a very quick supplementary. If we could have a quick reply.
Chairman, very briefly, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting Mrs. Oakes-Odger to come here today. She gave written evidence last time. I'm more than aware of all the hard work she's doing, and I just wanted to pay tribute to her and also to thank the committee for having such a first-class personal testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Thank you, Mrs. Oakes-Odger.
Thank
If
you.
we could turn to you now, Mr. Levy. You're a college lecturer in auto engineering, but your son Robert was only 16 when he was murdered a few yards away from your home in Hackney.
It was right at our gate, actually.
In September 2004.
That's right.
He was trying to stop a fight. He intervened to help a younger boy who was being threatened with a knife, and he then suffered multiple stab wounds.
That's
initiated by a 15-year-old schoolboy. You and your wife, Patricia, have set up the Robert Levy Foundation.
yes.
Can you tell this committee, has any progress been made in the reduction of knife crime since Robert's death?
Over the preceding years, we have seen where the number of knife crime has actually gone up in and around London. So to answer your question, no would be my my answer. As for why that is happening, there are a number of reasons, as you may have heard. You've all heard time and time again. But certainly, the numbers have gone up.
Bob Russell.
Thank you. So, what do you think causes young people to carry knives and to commit the violent crime? In the case of your son, we know, but is that the general scenario or the other situations?
Well, we all know that there are three main reasons given for young people carrying a knife. One is status or fashion accessory for the commission of crime, and the one that is most often used is for protection. I think most young people who you ask, or almost all young people you ask, will say they carry it for protection because that is the simplest and the easiest reason to justify the possession of a knife in any case. As for the reason for using it, it's about the mindset of the young person. Maybe it's an issue where they're under pressure from older people to be part of a gang. It's just to increase their status within that peer group, and also just to carry out the act of a crime for financial gain or other purposes. So the whole issue around why they carry a knife, to me, what we should be saying is absolutely nowhere anybody should carry a knife. And like the chief superintendent said, to carry a knife is to use a knife. And I personally think that is a strong message that should be sent across. We are all, in some ways, responsible for sending mixed messages to young people who do not truly understand the effect of the action until they have committed such crime. And what we should be saying, instead of saying, well, we can understand you carrying it for protection, we should be saying, absolutely not. No way should you be carrying a knife. On the issue of sentencing, it's nice to have increased the maximum period of sentence of possession of a knife in a public place to 4 years. But in order for us for that to have the desired effect, it shouldn't be around a maximum sentence. It should be around a mandatory sentence, because up and down the country, that use of a maximum sentence has always been there. Well, it's been there for some time, and it's rarely ever been used. What has come across from a lot of young people is that if they find that there is a maximum sentence, or a mandatory sentence, they know that they're going to be put away for 4 years. That does send a strong message to them. What comes across is that young people seeing their friends being sentenced for possession of a knife, and within a very short period of time, they're back in the community, and that has the opposite effect of being a deterrent. It then becomes a badge of honor where they can say, well, I've been inside for this, and here I am again. And it does nothing to boost the confidence of the young people within the community who are trying to stay away from that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Tom Brake.
Mr. Levy, you clearly don't believe that having a 4-year sentence, unless it is mandatory, is actually going to do the job. Is that right in terms of sending out the right messages?
Absolutely. In the past we've had a maximum of 2 years, which has hardly ever been used, and it hasn't worked. Even if we increase the maximum to 5 years or 6 years, and it's not being used, it will not have the effect that it is intended to have. But unless a strong message is sent to young people who are persistent knife carriers, or they carry knife as a routine, unless that message is sent that if you're caught in a public place carrying a knife, you will be sent to prison for 4 years. That is one of the only things I think that will send that message to them. We're not talking about a young person who may be on the verge of doing something like this, or somebody who's very timid. We're talking about people whose main purpose in life, or whose main goal in life, is to cause serious harm and destruction to other people within the community.
I think it's important for the committee to hear from you, from your personal experience. So you are making a difference between a young person who, for whatever reason, carried a knife on one particular day, and someone who, in your words, is a persistent offender who perhaps has a track record of carrying a knife on him, and that there would be a difference in terms of whether a mandatory sentence was applied to one of the young person that I mentioned first, or the persistent offender. So there should be a distinction.
Absolutely. When you go into a court and you hear of some people's previous, and time again, especially in a magistrate court, time and time again, somebody's previous records, they've been done 3 or 4 times for possession of a knife in a public place. The magistrate's hands are tied, in the sense that what more can they do to send a message to this individual? And we cannot wait until the point where they then start to use that knife and either seriously injure or kill somebody before we're able to do something about putting that person away.
Would you also agree, however, that yes, young people may think twice if there is a mandatory sentence, but equally, surely they've got to believe that they're going to be caught with it on them, and that part of the equation has also got to be resolved. If they don't think they're going to be caught, then surely they're not going to be worried about a mandatory sentence.
Well, there are 2 things here. First of all, I think the stop and search has been very effective in tackling that, and I think it should be extended, and that pressure needs to be kept up. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that whatever happens, the young person must know that there's every chance that they will be caught. We get reports from the police that they know, they can tell you how many gangs exist in London. They can tell you who these gang members are. And one of the ways that pressure can be kept up is by the police actively targeting these individuals if they are known to them, and especially if they're known to carry a knife. If they're actively targeted every day, then that message will get across that there's every chance that if you walk through your door with a knife, the police know who you are, you will be stopped and searched. So that should counter that mindset that they won't be caught.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Levy. Patrick Mercer.
Thank you. Mr. Levy, your foundation works to get young people into training and employment, and thereby divert them away from crime. How easy has it been to persuade organisations to offer work experience and mentoring? And could the government do more to encourage that?
To be quite honest, I don't know if it's out of sympathy, but I do find that a lot of organisations are willing to get involved with helping young people. A lot of companies, through their CSRs, do encourage their employees to offer at least a day a year volunteer to help local voluntary groups to go into schools, etc. So on that basis, there is a willingness to do that. But what we're interested in is that long-term contact, or that long-term support from employers to make this happen. what we find, and before we started to look, when we started to look at this, one of the things that young people said to us is that there's always something there, but it only lasts for so long, and then it ends, and then they're back to stage one when there's nothing to do, nobody's supporting them, etc. What we're looking for is that continuation at all times to make sure that there's that engagement with employers.
Thank you. Final question from Wim Prosser. Maybe I should ask it, what more do you think the government should do?
I think that the government needs to look at the penal system to start with. People argue that the prison system doesn't work, and I would agree, because the prison system as it is not what it should be. It's not the deterrent that it should be. Young people or people on a whole who commit crime against the community in which they live should be made to put something back into the community, instead of the community constantly paying for them to stay in prison to do nothing whatsoever. That aspect of it needs to be addressed, because I've visited quite a few young offenders institutions, and what I see and what I've heard from prison officers is absolutely appalling, where a young person over 18 does not have to do anything. He can sit in his cell all day long if he wants to. He's got his television, he's got PlayStation. And at one point, a prison officer said to me, there was an incident where the PlayStations that was given to them, it came to light that they could access the internet. And when they decided to withdraw that, there was almost a riot in the prison. And I find that absolutely shocking, that somebody who is in prison as a punishment and you know, got something taken off of them, think they have the right to riot within the prison because that is taken away from them.
Now, the Home Secretary is on her way. If you were Home Secretary for just one day, not an unlikely scenario, bearing in mind the significance of today in the United States of America, what is the one thing that you would do that you think would reduce knife crime? Just the one thing.
One, make the prisons what it should be, and two, make sure that the legislation that is put in place does act as the deterrent that it should be, in terms of, like I said before, making mandatory sentences instead of making it just something that is random for judges can use at their discretion.
And you set up the Robert Levy Foundation. Presumably it is highlighting the work that you've talked about today. It is trying to campaign on these issues.
Yes.
How successful has it been?
Well, we mainly work within Hackney because that's where we live. Over the past few years, we have seen the awareness has grown because we're getting into more and more schools. We've been asked to come into more and more schools to work with young people in terms of mentoring, etc. And often we find, in a few cases, the schools actually call us in because there are young people as young as sort of 9, 10-year-olds who are on the verge of getting into crime. They've either got older siblings who are involved in gangs or are, in some cases, in prison. And that behavior is being brought into schools. And we've asked to come in to talk to these young people, to tell them what it is like from our experiences, and also to mentor them or to help them, and work with the parents as well to make sure that the message does get across to them.
Mr. Levy, Mrs. Oakes-Odger, not only do you have the huge sympathy of this committee over your terrible, terrible loss, but also our admiration that both of you in your brief have set up campaigning organisations to try and prevent this happening to the parents and families of other young people. And we do admire what you've done. We're extremely grateful to you for giving evidence to us today, because it will help us enormously in our deliberations on this very important issue. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Order, order. That concludes the evidence session for our inquiry into knife crime. We'll take a short adjournment, and we await the arrival of the Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office. Order, order.
This week is gone. What about wider? And what are the Thursdays?
your job, isn't it? Part-time job.
Previous case on that way, they looked for pass holders and so they're deterring as well. I imagine don't know whether student auditors got a pass. And that's why we go the other way. So we don't want to get muddled up with the public when they come back in again.
He believes the conspiracy is still working.
Could we put her little things crooked and nameplate? We can't have a crooked nameplate.
I think she's missing a magnet.
No, not that bit.
It was on. I think it was crooked because it's missing a magnet. I think that's what it was. V-shaped ones. I suppose if you put on the floor.
Is that somebody's hearing? We've currently lost the Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary, and Mr. Mercer has gone to find them. Mr. Davis is not willing to go and find Mr. Mercer, will you? Mr. Davis will go and find Mr. Mercer. When it comes down to me, I think we'll stop. Yeah, I think James is next.
We might send the media.
We'll do it on a seniority basis. Simon, any news of the Home Secretary?
Not behind me.
Simon is right.
Do we want the Home Secretary as soon as she arrives?
Oh, yes. There she is. Yes. Aha! There we are. Well done, Mr. Mercer.
Okay, so we're about to start.
Order. Could I bring the committee to order and apologise for the fact that we had to adjourn. I can assure everyone that the Select Committee will not be holding an inquiry into the fire that never was. Home Secretary Sir David, welcome to this session. This is the first session of our inquiry into policing process of Home Office leak inquiries. It's a two-part session. Next week we hope to have the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London giving evidence to this committee. Can I start, Home Secretary, by asking you, has there been any development since your statement to the House on the 4th of December, when you first told the House about the circumstances surrounding the leak inquiry and the arrest of Mr. Green?
I don't believe there have been any developments, I think, in the way in which you're asking, Chair. And perhaps I could just say, by way of introduction to this part of the session, that obviously my Permanent Secretary and I have agreed to appear in front of you. We'll be as helpful as we can in terms of, as I hope I was when I did the statement in Parliament before Christmas. At the same time, I'm sure that the whole committee would understand that we, of course, have got to be very careful not to prejudice an ongoing police investigation. I think it's worthwhile just reminding people that in the statement I made to the House, I was very clear that I thought there were 4 important principles at stake: that no one should be above the law, that the police should have the operational independence to conduct their investigations without fear or favour, that members of the House should be able to do their work and be able to hold the government to account, and that the impartiality
of the civil service should be protected. And throughout this whole process, I've been at pains to support the operational independence of the Metropolitan Police and, of course, to uphold the Civil Service Code. I'll be as forthcoming as I can. I think it's probably worthwhile saying that it does remain my view that it's inappropriate to comment on issues arising from the handling of the police investigation whilst it's ongoing. When the investigation and any possible proceedings arising from it do reach a conclusion, I am clear that at that point there will be, I think, a range of issues arising from both the investigation and, in fact, the whole episode that we will want to follow up. But obviously it will be difficult to go into detail on some of those today, but we will be as helpful as we can.
Thank you very much. And you've always been very generous with your time whenever the committee has asked you to give evidence. We're not just examining you today on this inquiry. There are a number of other issues that have arisen since your last evidence session to the committee which we wish to touch on: counter-terrorism and indeed the accountability of the police. Those are two of the issues that we're likely to raise today. But in respect to what you've just told the committee, we have in fact taken legal advice, and we are confident that our inquiry will not impinge on any ongoing investigation by the Metropolitan Police. You mentioned a possibility of a review at the end of this process. Is that likely to be an internal review of what has happened or an external review? I understand you can't talk about the substance, but have you made up your mind as to what sort of review you have in mind?
Well, it depends what you mean by external review. I mean, I think it may well be something where we would want to... if you mean internal only to the Home Office, then no.
So there's likely to be something that goes beyond the Home Office. After all these matters have been settled,
yes.
You will be initiating a review that goes beyond an internal review.
Yes.
Can I start by asking, Sir David, in a letter that the Director of Security at the Cabinet Office sent to the Metropolitan Police that started off this whole matter, the issue of the type of documents leaked was raised, and in the letter that he wrote he talked about documents relating to national security. What most excited you about the documents that you'd lost? What documents have actually been leaked that caused you concern?
Of course, by definition, I don't know for sure what has been leaked. I know that the Home Office has had about 20, just over 20 leaks of documents, emails or information over 2007, 2008. But of course I don't know whether there is more material that's been leaked which isn't in the public domain. I think it's important to say about that letter, which was the letter from the Cabinet Office inviting the police to do the investigation, that it's really saying three things. One is we're very concerned about the damage to the operation of the Home Office. And that was serious, just in terms of the relationship with ministers and the confidence that people could have in us. Secondly, there was the concern that since it was clear that the leaker or leakers was close to the heart of the Home Office, there was a potential risk to national security. And thirdly, there is a wider context here, which the letter refers to, of Cabinet Office concerns about the leaks over a number of years of national security information, some of which there was a possibility had come from the Home Office. And it's that is the context for the decision to call in, well, in my case, first the Cabinet Office and then the police. We will come on to the
systematic leaking of documents, but you are satisfied, because it's in the public domain, that the civil servant concerned was an assistant secretary, that it's at that kind of security level that the documents would have been cleared out?
He wasn't an assistant secretary. He wasn't an assistant private secretary. He provided administrative support. He was an administrative officer, and he provided administrative support to a number of parts of private office.
So in terms of the ranking, it would be below the ranking of assistant private secretary?
Yes.
He was an admin officer?
Yes.
Working in the Home Office?
Yes.
And on the question of the documents that were leaked by the Home Office, presumably you would find out about it because you open the newspaper, you'd open the Guardian or the Times or the whatever, and you'd see the document in there, so you knew the leak was occurring?
Yes.
From the newspaper articles?
Yes, that was usually the way it was done. Yes, of course, mainly from the newspapers. Of
and
course.
Ministers would be concerned, the Home Secretary, presumably that's how you would have found out something was leaked?
Well, I think the important point here is that, of course, you find out that something's been leaked if it appears in the newspaper, but it doesn't necessarily follow that everything that's been leaked appears in the newspaper. And I think that is part of the concern that the PermSec was representing, that of course when you get to a situation where there have been 20 leak investigations over a period of 2 years, that does then raise questions about the extent to which other information, classified information, may be at risk as part of that process.
I just want you to paint the picture practically of what happened. You'd find out that there was a leak, you'd get in the morning, you'd see Sir David and say, Sir David, yet another leak, what are we going to do about it? What was the kind of language used that so excited
It's not quite like that.
Well, tell us what it is like then. How did it go if it didn't go as I described?
Well, in fact, usually what happened, the responsibility, of course, for initiating a leak inquiry rests with the Permanent Secretary,
sure,
with responsibility for the security of the department, and with the Cabinet Office more broadly, with security responsibility for the government. Is there frustration amongst ministers at the idea that the very important relationship between civil servants and ministers, incidentally of whatever potential political persuasion, and this of course is represented very clearly in the Civil Service Code, is there frustration about the extent to which it's possible to do the everyday business of government if you think that you're being the subject of a series of leaks? Yes, of course there is.
Sure, but I'm trying to do the practicalities here. Did you raise it with him? Did he raise it with you? Was it a collective raising of frustration? How was it done practically when you knew this was happening?
I mean, a bit of both really, but we were completely frustrated and very concerned about the situation. I don't think that we shared that. We seem to have somebody or some people who were deliberately and maliciously leaking material for political purposes. From my point of view, that is despicable, it's disloyal, it's completely undermining the work of the Home Office. It's completely unacceptable. And therefore, I don't need to be told that by the Home Secretary, but we often on that day would have had a conversation where we exchanged our frustration and our anger.
Steam would be coming out of ears and
from both of us, I think.
Right. Mr. Brake.
Could I just ask you, Home Secretary, at what point on what day you finally opened a newspaper to read about a link and you decided there's a systematic pattern of leaking going on and we now need to take firm action? At what point in recent history did the Home Office reach a point where they felt that there was a coordinated campaign of leaking?
Well, I think the point that the Home Secretary has made is that it probably wasn't one single occasion. But when you have a situation where you've had about 20 leak inquiries over the period of 2 years, then it does become, I think after a while, actually it becomes apparent that this may not be simply a series of separate or individual leaks, but it may be more systematic. It may relate potentially to an individual who, of course, given the work that we do in the Home Office, may have access to information that is, that should be, quite rightly, kept secret. And that's the sort of process that you think about and that I think raises the sort of concern that the Permanent Secretary has already expressed.
So, David?
Yes. Last summer, after a lot of these leaks had occurred, and we did decide to investigate almost all of them, we decided to ask someone to have another look back at them all to see if they could find a pattern. So in our minds there was an issue about whether this was systematic or not. In fact, they didn't really find anything which gave us a lead, and that in a sense is the first sign that we're thinking this must be more than just random leaks, this must be systematic. But it didn't at that point tell us the answer to that question.
So there wasn't one single leak that triggered this action. It was just the cumulative effect of a series of leaks.
Yes, and in late summer, in fact, when I came back from my holidays, I sat down with the Cabinet Secretary and we discussed the seriousness of what we were facing. And that is the point at which we began to talk about bringing in more expert help.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brooke. Mr. Winnock has a supplementary.
The sort of leaking that you described, Sir David, of course, is totally without any justification at all. I doubt if any member of the committee would say otherwise. But the actual position of this civil servant, in reply to the chair, you indicated was relatively junior. Am I right?
Yes.
And yet this junior civil servant had and handled information that concerned national security. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, I have to be careful. There are two answers to that. One is he had security clearance only up to the level of secret. He was working in places, therefore, where he would have access to some sensitive material. I have never gone on to claim that he leaked national security information. Indeed, I mustn't make that assumption. And a lot of the material that was leaked to the press was not national security information.
So, yes, because I'm rather puzzled. I can understand, as I've already said, that it's virtually impossible for the department to be running properly and smoothly when this sort of action is taking place. No one, as I've to repeat, would justify it. But the use of the term national security I find difficult to understand. There's a lot of immigration statistics that can be used and will be used in party political battles on the floor of a House of Commons and the rest of it. It's all part of our political process. But national security, what percentage of the leaking would you say concerned national security?
Could I just be completely accurate about this? When we discussed with the Cabinet Office whether we needed further help, and when we decided to seek the help of the police, we didn't, of course, know who it was who was leaking. So we didn't refer a specific individual who was very junior. We asked a question about how could we find out who was leaking, and it was the knowledge that the person or people must have had access to the Home Secretary's office and to her papers that gave us a great deal of concern that national security information might be at risk. The Cabinet Office also had a concern that there had been separate leaks, not of Home Office documents, but of a series of other material across government which did have a national security classification, which had been in the Home Office. And it's that set of things which caused us to be very concerned about it. But I have never claimed that the material that was, of course, leaked to the press, and which the chairman referred to, it was classified, most of it, but it didn't have the highest national security.
Thank you.
Gwyn Prosser.
So, David, just going on beyond that, you've also said that it had the potential, when you reported to the Cabinet Office, you said there was the potential to do damage to national security. But in the letter from the Cabinet Office to Bob Quick, the Assistant Commissioner, he says, we are in no doubt that there has been considerable damage to national security already. How do you reconcile the difference between those two stances?
I'm talking about three things. One is material leaking from the Home Office on a persistent basis, which was undermining the department. Secondly, the risk that posed to national security, because we didn't know who it was and we didn't know what they might have and what they might be leaking. And thirdly, the Cabinet Office's concern, which is what they're particularly referring to, that there had been a wider set of leaks of national security information over quite a number of years. Some of that material had been in the Home Office, and they had been, as they say in the letter, concerned that that had come from the Home Office as well. And the question was this all linked?
Thank you.
And that's what that is about.
Let us move to the referral to the Cabinet Office. Janet Dean.
Can you say, Sir David, exactly when you decided that the internal inquiry could go no further?
I continued to ask for internal inquiries of the leaks we had into September, but during September last year, the discussions with the Cabinet Office led to us thinking that we needed the police's help, and the police were written to on the 8th of October. So September, but in parallel with those discussions, we continued to investigate the latest leak, because there was one, I think, at the beginning of September.
Can you say whether the action you took was the best practice in these situations?
I believe it was best practice. The Cabinet Office have overall responsibility for security in government, and they do. And in fact, they have provided a memorandum to the Public Administration Committee which sets out what the best practice is in this area, and when you should seek their help and when you could bring in the police. And I believe, because of what I've described, that I was following best practice, or we were following best practice.
Karen Buck.
Just returning to the issue of what the Home Office advised the Cabinet. We've seen and have referred to the letter that was sent to the police. In what terms was the referral to the Cabinet Office made? Did it use the same form of language? Did it use the word national security at any point?
It wasn't like that. The Cabinet Secretary and I had a discussion. We agreed that that should be followed up with some more detailed discussions about our problem between the Home Office and the Cabinet Office, and during that, effectively, we laid out for them all our information and said, how can you help us? And we then had a discussion with them about the means of help, and they put it together with what they knew about their investigations across government, and it was out of that that they decided, we decided that the police should be invited in.
So this was a series of discussions?
It was a series of discussions. There wasn't a moment when I
was
wrote formally to the Cabinet Office to commission them. It wasn't like that.
And what advice did they give you back on the basis of the presentation that you made to them about this structure of leaks and the content?
They believed we should refer this matter to the police. They believed that this was serious enough. And of course they had some wider context which they also took into account in that decision. And I believe that was right, and I mean, in a sense, I could have said, no, I'm not having the police in my department. It's a very big step. I don't want to think...
We'll come on to the referral in a second.
I don't want to think I took the decision lightly at all.
Because in the letter of the 8th of October, who is the Director of Security and Intelligence in the Cabinet Office?
It's somebody called Chris Wright.
He wrote to Bob Quick, and the only department mentioned in this letter is the Home Office.
Yes.
And the important phrase is, we are in no doubt that there has been considerable damage to national security already as a result of some of these leaks, and we are concerned that the potential for further damage is significant. Now, in answer to Mr. Winnick, you said the words national security have never been used by you. We, of course, accept that. But this was used in this letter.
No, national security, I did use the terms national security in discussions with the Cabinet Office. I didn't claim...
Not in terms of the leak?
I didn't claim that most of our leaks had the national security classifications.
But are we saying that some of the leaks relating to the information that Mr. Galley had in his possession, in answer to what Mr. Winnick has said, were national security issues? Were any of them to do with national security?
I don't know what Mr. Galley has and has not leaked.
That's in the public domain.
I still don't know.
You don't know?
I don't
Have you
know.
read the newspapers whether or not it's national security?
Let me be clear. I know about the leaks that have appeared in the newspapers.
Yes, well, on those leaks, that's all you know about.
I make no comment on whether that is linked with Mr. Galley, and I mustn't do that.
But on all you've read in the newspapers so far, we're not asking you about other things.
Most of those leaks were not national security.
Okay, let us just be clear, Sir David. If you just wait till sorry, I know you're wanting to answer.
Right.
Of the leaks you've read about in the national newspapers so far, which is all this committee is aware about, we read the same newspapers as you do, are any of those leaks issues of national security, those that are in the national newspapers?
Over the 2 years, at least one of those leaks.
One?
Yes.
And you don't know whether or not they are traced to Mr. Galley at all?
I don't. And I've never made any suggestion that they are, because that would be quite wrong of me. That is, in a sense, what's been investigated.
And in terms of the internal discussions that were going on in the Home Office, you were keeping the Home Secretary informed daily, weekly, monthly?
Probably weekly.
Weekly?
Yes.
As part of a general discussion?
Well, we meet
weekly.
Yeah.
The steam coming out of years discussion?
We don't spend the whole of our weekly meeting with steam coming out of our ears.
I'm very pleased to hear it. Maybe Mr. Winnick can now take this forward about the police being called in.
Yes, Home Secretary, one can understand the police being called in. What causes a great deal of concern to parliamentarians is the fact that the police invaded the office of a Member of Parliament in the building. It now appears, rising from the Speaker's statement, there was no search warrant. Do you yourself, as a Member of Parliament, leaving aside your very senior cabinet position, are you concerned that the police acted as they did?
Look, the point here is that, yes, I am a Member of Parliament, but I am also the Home Secretary. I am, therefore, not only responsible for, within government, for the police service, but I am also, of course, the Home Secretary within whose department the inquiry started. Therefore, I do believe that it is wholly inappropriate for me to go further than I've gone, for example, in the statement that I made to Parliament before Christmas about the rights or wrongs of the way in which the police investigation has been carried out. But I would just remind the committee that, first of all, of course, Sir Paul Stevenson, the Acting Commissioner, has asked Ian Johnston to carry out a review of the process and the methods that were used by the police, number one. Secondly, that of course in relation to the point about the legality of the search that was done in Parliament, Bob Quick has wrote a letter which of course has been made available to parliamentarians and also of course to the committee that Mr Speaker has set up to determine some of precisely those issues that you talked about.
Do you are you of the view at this particular stage of what happened as far as the police is concerned in the Palace of Westminster was right?
No, you're asking me the same question that you asked me last time, and I've just explained to you why I believe that as Home Secretary, during the course of an ongoing police operation, it is not appropriate to make comment on the methods that are being used as part of that police operation.
Will you be willing, once the police inquiry has completed, to come back to this committee and answer questions on this particular aspect?
Well, I think I've made quite clear that once the investigation and if there is any subsequent action after the investigation is over, that there are actually issues to do with the investigation that are worthy of further consideration.
Have you seen a copy of the Johnson Review?
No.
Do you expect to see a copy?
That was an internal review that was made available for the Metropolitan Police. I don't necessarily expect to see a copy of it, no.
We accept, of course, there's an operational independence for the police, but this case is exceptional, is it not, in that you have asked for an update of precisely what the police are doing, which you have then placed in the library of the House. That's not a routine thing for a Home Secretary to do, is it?
Well, no, there are certain things about which Bob Quick has written to me. You're right, once it became clear that there was the concern, understandable, about the investigation, the interest about the investigation. When I made my statement to Parliament, I was also clear about the conversations that I had had with the Acting Commissioner about the process that was then underway. Although it is worth saying, as I said at that time, that I have been extremely clear in every conversation that I have had with the Acting Commissioner that, in my view, the process of the investigation is wholly for the police to determine, but that what I was interested in was that where it was possible for information to be made available, for example, to parliamentarians, that I facilitated that happening, and that I was clear that that was an investigation that was being done proportionately and in a way that the Commissioner was able to reassure, not just me, but of course in public statements that he made to the GLA, was actually being pursued in an appropriate way.
Because your last letter to him, your request for information, was put in the library of the House in December. Have you written to him since? Because now, I think a month has gone since then.
No, I haven't written to him since.
Do you intend to write again?
No.
Why is that?
Well, I don't believe that what is most appropriate here whilst a police investigation is going on is some sort of running commentary either from the Home Secretary or from the Acting Commissioner.
Martin Salter.
Thank you very much. Home Secretary. As we've heard, on the 8th of October, the Cabinet Office wrote to the police asking them to investigate the systematic leaks from the Home Office. They claimed that there has been considerable damage to national security already as a result of some of these leaks. This was a claim that was then ridiculed by the opposition in the strongest possible terms. However, on the 28th of November, I note that the former Shadow Home Secretary rather destroyed this claim by admitting that matters covered by the Official Secrets Act were being passed to the opposition. He's actually on the record as saying, on the 28th of November, our job, when that information comes to us, is to make a judgment. Is it in the public interest that this should be known publicly or not? In about half the cases, we decide not to, because we think there are reasons, perhaps of national security or military or terrorism reasons, not to put things in the public domain. So here we have it in black and white, that the opposition admitting that they are receiving matters that would be covered, or leaks of information that would be covered by the Official Secrets Act. Two questions. What's your reaction to the claims made by the Shadow Home Secretary, former head of Shadow Home Secretary? And secondly, why on earth was the Official Secrets Act not used to make the arrests?
Well, on the first one, as I've actually made clear in the Chamber of the House of Commons, I do tend to agree with you that it makes the case that there has been a systematic approach to, the former Shadow Home Secretary appears to slightly make to be proud of the fact that there has been a systematic gaining of information by himself and people who have worked for him that relates to the range of issues that you've talked about, which slightly, more than slightly, I think, suggests that our concern that there was systematic leaking going on had at least some basis in the words of the previous Shadow Home Secretary. On the second point about whether or not any charges would be made under the Official Secrets Act, that is, of course, a decision for the police in consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service in terms of the evidence which may or may not be available at the time at which those decisions are taken.
Do you think it's entirely possible that the police have gone after the wrong politician?
I think, given that I didn't answer the question that Mr Winnick put to me, it's probably a good idea that I don't answer that one either.
Thank you, Mr Salter. David Davis.
Mr Secretary, did the police operation focus on all of the leaks, or merely the one which you know of, which related to national security?
No, I don't accept the premise of your question, number one. I think the Permanent Secretary and the letter from the Cabinet Office makes very clear the basis on which the reference to the police was made, one, and secondly, I don't know the details of the evidence on which the police are basing their investigation, and neither does anybody else.
The Permanent Secretary has just told us that he knows of only one leak which he felt related to national security, and he conferred with him beforehand. Surely the law is quite clear that the other leaks do not relate to a criminal matter, and therefore the police investigation should have been focused and should continue to focus on the one leak that you know of that related to national security, should it not?
No. First of all...
Or are the police just helping you out because your department's a bit embarrassed by some other information that leaked out?
First of all, the Permanent Secretary has been very clear, as is the Cabinet Office letter, that the reason for the reference to the police and the reason for the concern actually was on three counts. Number one, the systematic leaking of Home Office information and the detrimental effect that was having on the operation of the department. Secondly, that potentially, given that it was not clear at that point who was doing the leaking, where they worked, what they had access to, and given the sensitive nature of the information that we routinely deal with in the Home Office, that there could be links between that leaker potentially being at the heart of the Home Office did make other information vulnerable. And thirdly, that more widely, the Cabinet Office had concerns about issues related to national security where there had been leaks. Some of that information may well have been in the Home Office. No judgment about whether or not that was part of the 20
So they investigated
leaks.
on the basis that he might have done?
No question as to whether or not those leaks had necessarily been part of the 20 leaks. As the Permanent Secretary made clear, at the point at which the reference was made to the police, there was no he. There was not anybody identified. That was the point of making a reference that was agreed by the Cabinet Secretary and the Permanent Secretary, and with which, incidentally, I agreed.
Are you ever informed in advance when individuals are arrested?
Sometimes, yes.
But not in this case?
No.
Did you, or anybody else in your department, ask that you not be informed if a front bench opposition or a politician was going to be arrested?
As I have answered at least 3 times on the record in Parliament, no.
To David Normington, you must have had some idea when you read the papers, or that if you launched a police investigation, it could end in the arrest of an opposition politician. Did you ever discuss that possibility with them?
Of course not. It's
It's a mile away from...
You've never ever discussed that possibility
No.
with anyone? Right. And finally, Home Secretary, is the Assistant Commissioner a friend of yours? I
Which
just
Assistant
wondered why,
Commissioner? Mr Davis?
Mr Quick, I just wondered why you kept referring to him as Bob in some of the interviews that took place afterwards. That's a reasonable question, isn't it?
No, I don't. He isn't a friend of mine. I believe that I have a wholly professional relationship.
That's
and
why I
think
call you Home Secretary, not Jackie.
And I think you have called me Jackie at various times, actually, David. And we're certainly not
now, I
friends.
think we're getting a bit informal here. I think let's go back to Mr and Mrs. Anyway, if he was a friend of yours, he probably isn't, since you didn't shortlist him for the Metropolitan Commission still. Mr Clapperson has a question on this. We're on knowledge of when the arrest was taking place.
Could I ask Sir David Normington, please? I've seen the brief statement which you issued about this. Can you clarify the matter? When was it that you actually knew that a member of the opposition, any member of Parliament, was the subject of this police investigation?
At 1:45 on the 27th, which in my statement...
Of November?
Of November, yes, when I was rung
You
by,
say
I think Bob Quick, actually, to be told that the offices and homes of a Conservative front-bench spokesman were to be searched.
in your statement you said, I was informed by the Metropolitan Police at about 1:45 that a search was about to be conducted of the home and offices of a member of the opposition front bench. I was subsequently told that an arrest had been made.
Yeah.
But did you know that a member of the opposition front bench or any MP was the subject of an investigation before that?
No.
So that had never come up in your experience?
No.
Do you find that surprising that you weren't told about that?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I was very focused on my leaker. My whole aim has been to find my leaker. It is a matter of record, as we've discussed, that the opposition had been using some of the material that my leaker or leakers had used. But it's just a mile from that to believing that an opposition front-bench spokesman would himself become the subject of investigation. And I didn't believe that was going to happen, and I'm afraid it didn't occur to me that it would.
That wasn't within your range of contemplation. You never drew a connection between the fact that here with the opposition, as you say, received this information, but that they might be subject then of the investigation.
I didn't believe that a front-bench spokesman would be the subject of the investigation, no.
No. I mean, there is a sense here, if I can put this to Home Secretary, that this has all got out of hand and that it's resulted in something which is actually a very serious impact as far as Parliament is concerned. That you've put your case for this today, but how would you, to the members of the public, draw a distinction between this case and the many other cases which there have been in the past, including with other oppositions and other governments, of leaks which have taken place then?
Well, as I have also previously said in Parliament, I think it is absolutely incumbent on us as politicians to defend the right of politicians to use information that they get access to in a variety of ways, either to make their political case or to hold governments to account. That is wholly part of our function. There is a significant distance between that and a process from the point of view of of the civil service, which is about a systematic series of leaks, or that is, no, I won't go any further than that, that is about a sort of systematic series of leaks.
The characteristics which you have used to try and differentiate this would apply to leaks which there have been in the past. They have been systematic, they have been of information which is embarrassing to the government.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to.
Well, I think I'm not going to go into, you know that there have been previous leaks which have been admitted by members of oppositions in the past, which have been used to embarrass the government of the day. And I'm putting to you, what is the distinction between that and this? Because this has all got out of hand, because in this occasion we have seen the police coming into Parliament and searching a member of Parliament's desks and offices and arresting them.
Well, no, let's be quite clear. I think I've been very clear that the difference is the systematic nature of the leaks that have occurred this time, as the Permanent Secretary has outlined, and incidentally, of course, as the Home Office civil servant has himself placed on the public record in words that were, in a statement that was given by his solicitor, where it was made quite clear actually that this was, I think the words were almost regular or close to regular series of leaks over a period of time. Now, I do think that that is fundamentally different in terms of the impact that it has on the ability of a government of any persuasion to be able to operate, and given the nature of the business that we deal with in the Home Office, the potential risk to information that we have a duty on behalf of the country to maintain securely.
Can we just look at the timescale here on the 27th of November? You were informed, you say, at 1:45. That is when Bob Quick telephoned you.
I think actually if I'd have taken the call, which I was just out of the office.
You were out of the office?
I would have taken it about 15 minutes earlier. But I
was it 1:30?
Somewhere around that, I think.
Okay.
So I came back and took it, rang him straight back.
And he informed you, we're going to arrest Damien Green. Yeah. Were you shocked?
No.
No.
He didn't actually.
What did he
say? It's quite important, this. He
yes.
said, we are going to search the offices and homes of a Conservative front-bench spokesman.
And didn't tell you who that was?
I asked who it was, and I was told that it was Damien Green.
Right. So you knew at 1:30 it was going
and
to
you
be...
at 1:45. That's when the conversation took place.
Right. And then, of course, your first instinct is, were you shocked? Were you surprised? Did you expect it?
I was extremely surprised, and I expressed that surprise.
And you didn't say, why are you going to do this? This is a gentleman who shadows the Home Office.
I said something like, well, I hope you have the evidence for that.
You said what?
I hope you have the evidence for that.
Right. So, and his reply was?
No, I think I shouldn't. I can tell you what I said. I think it's not fair to say what he said, because that's his...
So your surprise ended with you saying, well, I hope you've got the evidence to do what you're proposing to do, basically.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, though I think the tone of my voice was surprised.
Was surprised?
Yes, of course.
Right. Okay, good. Well, we'll try to get all the colour behind all this. Then, and the mood music. You then decided, gosh, I must tell the Home Secretary.
Yes, I certainly did.
Did you feel, thank goodness we found the leaker?
Well, I believed, no, this wasn't the moment of feeling pleasure about finding the leaker, because the leaker had already been arrested the week before.
So you already knew about the leaker, you knew the leaker had been arrested, so this came as an extra surprise?
Yes.
Yeah. So you wanted to tell the Home Secretary?
Yes.
But you weren't able to?
Well, yes, I was, in fact. The Home Secretary...
Well, the Home Secretary was told at 3 o'clock.
No, so could I just explain?
Yes, please, take us through the timeline.
So at 1:45, I received this news. Home Secretary was in Brussels at a Home Affairs Council, and I therefore went straight round to her private secretary, who arranged to pass this information to her straight away.
So personally, on taking the call in the Home Office, you rushed round to the private office to take... You knew the Home Secretary wasn't there?
Yes, but I
said... You know what she's up to?
Yes, I do, but I said we need to get this information to her, and
at about
that
what?
was done.
2 o'clock?
It was between, I don't know, 1:40, after 1:45, after the conversation,
so
just
you
before
told the
2.
private secretary?
Yes, and it took about 20-25 minutes, I think, because you were in the meeting.
You were at the JHA in Brussels.
Yes.
So eventually you got the call at what time?
For that piece of information at about 2:20.
2:20.
There is a further.
1 second.
There's a further step then.
Right.
At about 2:25, I was rung again by the Metropolitan Police and told that an arrest had been had taken place. That Damien Green had been arrested.
So at 1:45, you were told an arrest might take place.
No, I was told that the offices and homes were going to be searched.
And at 2:25, after the Home Secretary was told about the search,
yes,
you were informed about the arrest.
Yes.
Damien Green.
Yes.
And then you had to tell the Home Secretary again.
Yes, in fact, just before that, the Cabinet Secretary came on, and because he had received... Came on the phone to me, because he'd received the same information in parallel via the Cabinet Office, and we agreed that we needed to tell the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister as soon as we could.
Right, so 2:25 you knew about the arrest. What time did you tell the Private Secretary?
The same process was then. The Home Secretary had to be got out again. I think that's just before 3, or round about 3.
And that's the same time that the Prime Minister was informed?
I believe so.
During all these conversations that took place with Mr Quick, did he tell you that the Leader of the Opposition and that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner were also being informed of either the search or the arrest?
He told me at 1:45 that the London Mayor and David Cameron and the Cabinet Office had also been given this information.
So you were told first?
I don't believe so, but I don't know quite what. I think probably
we'll know next week.
I was probably told last, but I think that may just be an accident of timing. In that period between 1 o'clock and 1:45, there were those conversations going on. I don't know.
As the permanent secretary at the Home Office, were you surprised either that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner was being informed about, Metropolitan Police Chairman was being informed about this, or that the Leader of the Opposition was being informed? Did either of those pieces of information come as a surprise to you, or is this routine?
Well, I didn't at the time think it was very surprising. I certainly would have expected the Mayor, who is of course also the Chairman of the Police Authority, to have been told. I think that would have been quite normal practice. And I assumed that it was a courtesy that the Leader of the Opposition's office or he himself had been told. But I didn't think anything of that.
And this is routine when high-profile individuals are arrested.
I think the whole point is that I don't think there's anything about this investigation is routine for precisely the reasons that we're sat in this room discussing it today. So I think it's a bit hard to say, is that something that routinely happens?
But you did say in answer to Mr Davis that there are on other occasions when you were telephoned as Home Secretary to be informed that individuals are being arrested.
No, I said there were other occasions on which I might be told in advance that somebody was going to be arrested, particularly high-profile, some recent high-profile cases, some terrorist cases, for example, potentially.
And just to help the committee, how often does that happen? Once a year, twice a year?
More than, I would say probably more than twice a year.
Half a dozen?
Probably, yeah, about that.
Half a dozen times. Mr Clapperson had a supplementary, then Mr Davis, then Mr Winnick.
Yeah, just on this question of time, and I appreciate this all happening fairly close together. You told the Home Secretary about the search before the search took place, or as it was taking place?
I don't precisely know when the search took place, but I believe that the search was taking place around that time. I believe that I was being told as the operation was underway. I haven't checked that.
Because the Home Secretary, as the Home Secretary I think knows, was asked about this very thing on the floor of the House, and she said, I was not informed about the search of the Honourable Member's office until after both the search and the arrest had taken place.
I think that...
the Home Secretary.
Well, I've been... if those were the words that I used, I think what we've been very clear about today is that the Permanent Secretary was told at about 1:45, that I, at the Justice and Home Affairs Committee, was told at about 2:20, that the Permanent Secretary was told at about 2:25 that an arrest had taken place. So, you know...
And you were told again at 3
And I was told again
arrest.
at 3 about the arrest. So, I mean, you know, you can judge whether or not between 2:20 and 2:25 the arrest took place or not. I mean, I don't think that we know. I think we've been pretty precise with our time.
I understand that. The search is something which has caused considerable concerns, I'm sure you'd agree, in this place. And it's important to know whether you knew before or after the search took place that it was going to take place.
We don't know precisely when the arrest took place, but we think it took place at about 5 to 2. But, I mean, others will be able to confirm that. I'm afraid I don't know.
The search is what I'm interested in.
Well, I think... I'm afraid I don't know. The search and then the arrest took place in that period. I'm afraid I don't know precisely.
We will put that to the police when they come to give evidence. Mr Davis.
I think many people find it very surprising that you admit, and previous Home Secretaries I've spoken to have said that routinely they are told when high-profile people are going to be arrested because there are likely to be questions asked, media reports, etc., etc. Sometimes given quite some notice of that. And it, you know, people find it astonishing that you weren't told in advance about a front bench spokesman shadowing your own department, being arrested for putting into the public domain documents that embarrassed your department. Do you find it surprising that you weren't told in advance that this was going to happen?
I think I've responded to Mr Winnick on that, and certainly I think, you know, in terms of some of the issues that it will be well worthwhile us considering in the long term, that may well be one of them.
You think you should be informed next time?
Well, no. Let's be clear about this. I have been informed about either high-profile or sensitive arrests in advance. Previous Home Secretaries, incidentally, have not been informed about other politically sensitive arrests before they happened, for reasons that I suspect will be obvious. So there is a precedent for not informing Home Secretaries about politically sensitive arrests as well.
You're talking about the cash for honours?
Yes.
Mr Winnick.
So, David, you were told that the MP's office was going to be searched, was it made clear to you that the office in question would be in the House of Commons? I mean, wouldn't you have asked that? Because we all have offices here. I mean, it would have been the first question, wouldn't it?
Well, I didn't have that conversation, in fact. I'm just trying to recall. I think I assumed that the parliamentary office was going to be searched, and also the constituency office. I'm afraid I can't recall whether I actually specifically spoke about that issue.
You're one of the most senior civil servants. I mean, you're obviously so experienced about the relationship between Parliament and ministers and the rest. What I find surprising is that you wouldn't have recognised at once the sensitivity, not the identity of the opposition spokesperson. We've discussed that on other occasions, but the very fact that Parliament itself would be involved, and which led, of course, to the statement by the Speaker. That didn't occur to you at the time, or tell the Home Secretary accordingly?
The whole thing seemed very sensitive to me, and I thought it was completely out of the ordinary. And I did think that the searching of Parliament would be a particular issue. But I'm afraid I did, yes, but I'm afraid I didn't have a particular conversation about that. I was rather taken aback by the whole conversation, as you can imagine. I thought it was a rather surprising turn of events.
On reflection, do you think it would have been appropriate to have said to the police that this is a very sensitive matter regarding Parliament itself, and notify of it, you as the Permanent Secretary would notify the Home Secretary on that aspect at least?
I'm being reminded by my colleagues that I was told, because I said who I was told had been informed, I also was told that the Speaker had been informed. I do recall.
By Mr. Quick?
By Mr. Quick.
At 1:45?
Yes, and therefore I think I was trying to recall precisely what went through my mind, but I think I assumed that since the Speaker had been informed that...
And you didn't tell the Home Secretary?
I told... I imagine I...
Yes.
I think we passed all that...
The Parliamentary Office would be searched?
I think we passed all that information on, yes.
But the Parliamentary Office would be searched?
I believe was being searched.
That was at 2:20.
I believe we passed all that on, but if you're asking me, did I make a particular issue with Mr. Quick about Parliament? No, I didn't.
So, in summary, practically everyone was told, really. At 1:45 you were told, the Speaker was told, the Leader of the Opposition was told, the Mayor of London was told. Presumably their officers were aware that this arrest was going to take place, and the Home Secretary was then told as well. Are you glad, Home Secretary, that you weren't told?
I don't...
In advance of the action?
I'm neither glad nor unglad. I mean, that was the situation.
But you have told this committee for the first time that you are going to have a review, not an internal review, but possibly an external review, of all the issues surrounding this matter. That must mean that you have concerns about what has happened.
No, I think it's important, given the sensitivity of what's happened, that we take time, once the investigation and any subsequent action is over, to consider whether or not there are any lessons to be learned from that.
And you changed that position for the 4th of December, because when you spoke in the House and made your statement, there was no intimation from you at that stage that you planned to look at these issues at the end. You thought about it over the Christmas period.
What I've always been very clear about, and I think it is worth emphasising today, particularly given the question, Chairman, that you asked me about whether or not I was glad or not glad, is that even if circumstances had been different, I think it would have been wholly wrong for a Home Secretary to intervene in the process of a police investigation and operation. I think that would have been wholly wrong. However, I do think that there are questions about, as I've suggested, that it would be worthwhile considering and reviewing at the point at which that investigation and any subsequent action is concluded.
So will that be when, if any charges are dropped against Mr. Green, will that be when your review starts, or when will be the end game as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think it will be the point at which I am confident that no investigation will, or any subsequent action, if it exists, could potentially be prejudiced by what I would be asking to happen at that particular point.
Thank you. That concludes the questioning on our inquiry into policing processes. Thank you very much for giving evidence today. After we hear from the police next week, it may well be that we'd write to you requesting further information if the timelines don't match up. Can I now turn to counter-terrorism? When you were last before the committee, the issue of 42 days was very much in your mind, and you were obviously pleased that the House of Commons had supported your view that there should be a 42-day period. That was followed, of course, by a defeat in the Lords. You went before the House and you made a statement announcing the initiation of a new bill. What are the big differences between the bill that you are currently proposing to put before the Commons in an emergency and the previous bill in respect of the 42 days issue?
My memory about this might be faulty, but I think the last time I appeared before the committee was actually after the point at which I had made a statement to Parliament about...
Your mind is not faulty, my mind isn't faulty.
Right.
You're quite right. It was 2 sessions ago.
Yeah. So I have, of course, already answered questions to the committee about the temporary provision, the Counter-Terrorism Temporary Provisions Bill that we have prepared. The differences really stem from the fact that the proposals that we put forward in the Counter-Terrorism Bill now, the Counter-Terrorism Act, of course, were about enabling Parliament to discuss the principle of the issue away from the situation of emergency, the situation in which any application to detain somebody for longer than 28 days might need to be made, because it was my view then, and it is still my view now, that it is better to consider those issues in the calm of the parliamentary process before the emergency arises, rather than when and if the emergency arises. So the differences effectively were the provisions that were in place for the particular bringing into place of the order-making power, were it to be necessary, the safeguards that were placed around that, quite considerable safeguards that were placed around that, because what we were talking about was legislating then for something that was going to happen in the future. The Counter-Terrorism Temporary Provisions Bill actually is based on the current provisions for extending the period of pre-charge detention, with a few important changes, and therefore are based on tried and tested processes, which of course have been the subject of considerable discussion within Parliament previously.
Mr Winnick.
What do you say, Home Secretary, to the view that you simply, or the government, will not accept the decision of Parliament over 42 days?
I don't accept that. I mean, the first thing that I've always made clear is that I think the responsibility of government is to ensure that when it comes to the security of this country against terrorism, that we give those that we're asking to carry out that task, police, prosecutors and others, the tools that they need to do the job. That, as this committee has recognised, there is a potential scenario in the future where the scale of the potential attack, or the scale of a foiled attack, or the complexity of the investigation might necessitate, in order to get to a situation of bringing charges, considering whether or not somebody should be held for longer than 28 days. And what I'm concerned about is putting in place, as my proposals do, actually not a way to ignore the views of Parliament, but to provide Parliament with the opportunity to put those provisions in place if and when those circumstances arose.
Yes. But of course, the government was defeated, as we all know, on 42 days. And there is a feeling, perhaps you'll comment on it, that since the government was defeated, but it's not willing to give up, if, as we all hope will not be the position, if there was a terrorist attack in this country, the government will bring in this measure more or less immediately.
Well, I don't think the government, or any government, is ever willing to give up on thinking about the tools, whether legislative or otherwise, that are necessary in this country to counter terrorism, and I certainly won't do that whilst I'm Home Secretary. But, and I think actually I answered these questions the last time I came to the committee, our first response in any terrorist investigation would of course be to carry out that investigation as fully as possible in order to, if there were charges to be laid, ensure that that happened within the current 28-day period. In fact, as quickly as possible. But were a situation to arise where the attack or the foiled attack or the complexity was of such a scale that I felt, or any future Home Secretary felt, it was important to ask Parliament to give, of course, not the ability for anybody to be held longer than 28 days, but to give the Director of Public Prosecutions the ability to ask for somebody to be held longer than 28 days, then I presume that Home Secretary, whoever it is, may well bring forward this piece of legislation to Parliament for their decision at that particular point.
Mr. Messer.
Home Secretary, thank you very much for the explanation you've given so far. I'm slightly confused. I fully understand that this Act can be invoked, and yet we seem to be having two differing views from colleagues, subordinates of yours. The Security Minister, Lord West, a few weeks ago, described the situation, I'm paraphrasing, as having never been more serious, and that the threat, if anything, was escalating. Yet in an interview with, a recent interview, the head of MI5 suggested that actually things, however temporarily, were reasonably quiescent. What is it?
Well, I don't think actually there's a conflict between those views. I actually asked the Director General of the Security Service specifically whether or not he agreed with the headlines around his interview that suggested that the threat was reducing. He was very clear with me, as in fact I think he was clear in his interview, that the threat to the UK actually remains severe. That means an attack is highly likely. It could happen with no warning. He said in his interview, and I quote, "There is still an Al-Qaeda core in northern Pakistan trying to organise attacks in the UK. There are a number of networks in the UK and they're alive and kicking. There is plenty of activity and a few people who want to cause carnage." He went on to say, and I wholeheartedly agree with him about this, that the actions of both his service and the police and prosecutors in effectively investigating and in many cases bringing to conviction those who've been plotting terrorist attacks in the UK does mean that there has been success in dealing with some of that end attack planning. But as he pointed out, there remains a very complex and serious risk from the networks, from the sort of threat that he outlined in his interview.
Thank you.
Thank you. Margaret Moran.
Have you consulted with the new DPP and the judiciary on the provisions of the bill? And are they satisfied with the provisions as they relate to detention?
Well, the provisions of the bill, of course, are based on the current provisions for extending the period of pre-charge detention, which have, of course, had the support of Parliament in terms of quite detailed discussion and being brought forward. And of course, were it the case at any point in the future that it were necessary to bring in this piece of legislation, then the whole point of it is it enables the DPP, him or herself, actually to be the person that makes the application, were that legislation to be passed, for anybody if anybody needed to be held for longer than 28 days in those circumstances.
So you have consulted specifically?
Have we specifically consulted on this bill? No, because it is based on the provisions which are currently in existence.
Picking up what Mr. Mercer said, I've just returned from India. In visiting any of those five-star hotels in Mumbai or Goa, you are subjected to quite serious searches. Yet, when I went to a hotel off Park Lane recently, there were no such searches. Does it worry you that in those areas that might be the subject of a terrorist attack, that those private sector organisations are not really prepared? We had pictures of the January sales where hundreds, thousands of people were going to some of our biggest shops on Oxford Street. And is it not a worry to you that there are no searches going on in any of these areas?
Well, the protection of this country from potential terrorist attack to that extent is always a worry for any Home Secretary. And I think the Mumbai attacks did and have caused us to consider our protective security arrangements that we have in place in the light of those attacks, and a lot of detailed work has been and will go on in relation to that. There is always a challenge, which, if he were here, I'm sure Patrick Mercer would accept, given some of the very important work that he's contributed to our our work on protection in crowded places, there is always a balance between enabling people to go about their daily lives free in this country, which is of course what terrorists quite often are seeking to undermine and attack, and having in place appropriate protective security measures, not all of which of course are instantly visible to people when they're out shopping or in hotels. But we have, in fact, followed up...
There are no checks at all. If you go to any of these hotels, which must be potential targets, there are no checks at all if you walk into one of these hotels.
We have taken the opportunity of the review that we've done to look to accelerate, in fact, the publication of protective security guidance to both hotels and hotel security professionals, aimed at giving them the best advice on protective security. We have a network of officers who are actually and counter-terrorism security advisors who are able to supplement that advice by actually visiting specific venues and delivering training, and we're taking that forward. And of course, the work that we're currently doing more widely on the review of the contest strategy, which I know is the subject of the consideration by a subcommittee of this committee, also gives us the opportunity to make sure that any lessons and all the lessons that we can learn from what happened in Mumbai are more broadly fed into the review of the overall counter-terrorism strategy, and that's what we're doing, and I think it will be evident in terms of that new strategy as well.
Thank you. One quick question.
Some of us, Home Secretary, continue to be concerned that extremists in prison are indoctrinating people and sometimes converting them to their version of Islam, a version which would be rejected by the vast majority of Islamic people, and then preparing them or grooming them for terrorism. Are you satisfied that enough is being done in prisons? We've visited some over the years and looked into this aspect, but are you satisfied that all that can be done is being done at the moment to prevent what I've just mentioned?
Well, I don't think any of us can be satisfied that everything that we need to do in this country to counter extremism and radicalisation is being done, which is precisely the reason why, of course, I have put a strong emphasis on that prevent element of our counter-terrorism strategy. What I am satisfied about is that there has been a significant increase both in money being invested, for example, in the area of prisons, in training that's taking place for imams and other religious leaders within prisons, for work that's being done with prison officers, that this is a significant stepping up of that activity over what existed previously. So this is most certainly something, along with the broad range of areas with respect to prevent, that we are both concerned about and actively engaged in actually improving the provision around.
Can we move on to two final areas? First of all, police authorities. The committee would like to thank you for accepting our views that in the police and criminal and crime bill that you've just published, that you should not have proceeded with proposals for the election of police authorities. Given that you have decided to do that, how do you intend to address the democratic deficit that clearly is going to be in these committees?
Well, the first thing to say, Chairman, is that I think we are at the moment engaged in a major programme of reform within policing, which has at its heart how we can make policing even more visible, accountable and responsive to local people. And that involves both the development of neighbourhood policing, now in every neighbourhood across the country, the development of that through the policing pledge, which of course all police forces signed up to by at the end of 2008, that puts in place the basic standards that people can expect in terms of their relationship with policing, monthly meetings and access to the neighbourhood policing teams, monthly crime information and broader information to be able to make judgments, a commitment that local people's priorities will be represented in the local element of the pledge, a stripping away of all targets apart from a very important target to raise confidence amongst local people, which we're currently in the process of agreeing with all police forces already, which will, I think, transform the way in which the police service thinks about its relationship with local people. The provisions that we've already started to put in place with respect to police authorities, a new programme of inspection, reform of the way in which police authorities and their members are trained and supported. And when you add into that the new duty that the bill that, of course, had its second reading in Parliament yesterday has, I think that is a pretty wide programme of action to deliver greater responsiveness and accountability. I am still, incidentally, of the view that I think there is a role, a potential role for direct election on police authorities, but I think, as I've said previously, actually some of the arguments that have been made had some power. I think there is more work that we need to do to develop what is the right model to take that forward without some of the pitfalls that others have identified.
Let us see whether all that is good enough for Mr. Salter. Mr. Salter.
Thank the Home Secretary for seeing sense on this issue, and or at the very least allowing a breathing space, so that we can come forward with better policies. It was slightly mad in this committee to find your original proposals being supported by the member for Monmouth and attacked by your own side, but we are where we are. My concern, Home Secretary, is how we improve engagement. I think we can get hung up on the word accountability, but how we improve engagement without overtly politicising what should be a neutral police force. And actually, isn't engagement something that's delivered at a local, street and community level, not up there in the kind of tier of police authority, which is by its nature, certainly in my neck of the woods, a very large beast, 3 counties welded together. Should not we be looking at a much more local models of engagement?
Well, I completely agree with you that our first priority, and it has been our first priority, is how we make that engagement real at a local level. That's why the things that I've outlined, the neighbourhood policing, the development of the pledge, the monthly meetings, the local pledge in which people can, identify the 3 priorities in their neighbourhood that, alongside their neighbourhood policing team, they'll work on. All of those are crucial. I do, nevertheless, think that it is the role of police authorities then to ensure that that is continuing to be delivered. And that, of course, is the reason for the new duty that we're proposing. And I think there is an argument that a more directly accountable police authority will be stronger in its insistence that precisely that neighbourhood engagement is actually taken forward and underway. It's happening. We're absolutely committed to it, as are the police, all of the police forces that signed up to the policing pledge. But we need to make sure that the structures are there to actually maintain that into the future.
Mr. Salter, Gwyn Prosser.
Home Secretary, are there any lessons which other forces in the country can learn from the changes which have already been made within the Metropolitan Police Authority?
I think, and we made this clear in the Policing Green Paper, that there are unique elements to the way in which we structure the governance of policing in London that relate to there being, of course, an elected mayor, that relate as well to the relationship between the mayor and the GLA and the police authority. So I'm not convinced that there are that many lessons that can be learned from the London. For good or for bad? Well, you're slightly tempting me to repeat my view that one of the reasons why I think it is actually there is more concern about what I think is correct direct democratic accountability within police authorities is a suggestion that perhaps some of the activities of, frankly, the mayor at the end of last year raised questions about the politicisation of the police and the operational independence. And I do not want to see the politicisation of the day-to-day activity of policing. And I think it's very important that we're clear that that wouldn't happen through any reforms that we made.
Thank you very much.
Anne Pryor has a supplementary.
Secretary, at the moment, the crimes of honour of young ethnic minority women are running at 12 to 13 a year. About 3 years ago, the Met decided to set up a small unit, I think it was of 4 officers, to look back at those young women who had been killed and the deaths have been recorded as either accidental or suicide. And they were looking to see whether some of those could have been crimes of honour. I was told recently that unit had been run down to only 1, and I'm just wondering if even that 1 is still going on, or whether it's been, we've stopped the work altogether.
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, and of course the way in which resources are determined within the Met is, of course, the decision of the Commissioner and of the MPA. But if your argument is that so-called honour killings should be a priority for policing, I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Bob Russell has the final question on this issue.
Secondly, to what extent does the problem of accountability stem from the lack of everyday contact between police officers and the public, the perceived decrease in beat officers, the closure of local police stations, etc., rather than the formal structures for accountability?
Well, I think it depends on both. I don't incidentally accept your suggestion that there have been a reduction in beat officers. There haven't been.
I said perceived.
Okay, well, let's help people's perceptions by making clear that there haven't been a reduction in beat officers. There has, in fact, been with £1 billion worth of government investment, a development of a neighbourhood policing team in every neighbourhood in England and Wales, whose names people know, where people can access them, and their police community support officers that are a crucial part of those teams, at the school gate, through monthly meetings, through seeing them walking down their road, through having access to their contact details, through the sorts of information that's now much more widely available. I wholeheartedly agree with you that that is a fundamental way in which we can ensure that policing is visible and responsive, and incidentally through which as well we can make sure that the public have confidence to report crimes and actually work alongside the police in bringing down crimes and antisocial behaviour, and that's why I've made it such a priority.
Yeah. Home Secretary, I'm grateful for the emphasis you've clearly given there on the neighbourhood policing, which is clearly intended to bridge that gap, perceived or otherwise. And so far as the police community support officers is concerned, I'm grateful for what you said there. Is there any chance that that robust support of that part of the police family can be repeated by you and other Home Ombudsmen as time and time again? Because sadly, the Daily Mail in particular dismisses that element of the police family, and I personally think they're doing a grand job.
And I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I do repeat it time after time. And what's more important, as you will know, and as I think many people around the room will know, actually when we ask our constituents, they are extremely supportive of the work that police community support officers do as well.
We hear that you patched up your differences with the Mayor of London just in time to announce the new Commissioner. Is that right?
That's rather along the lines of when did I start beating my husband? When did I stop beating my husband, Chair? The Mayor of London and I think, have always, I hope have always had as a priority when it comes to the decision about the next Commissioner, choosing the person who will do the right thing for London and, of course, the right thing for their national responsibilities with respect to counter-terrorism and more widely as well.
And when do we expect a name? When does the white smoke come out of the chimney?
I don't believe it will be too long, but obviously the important point to make here is that the process is that actually the Home Secretary makes a recommendation to the Queen, and I would certainly not want to answer for the Queen, and I don't think it would be appropriate for any of us to push her on this.
Indeed. I think you have the support of the committee on that. Our final area concerns Home Office statistics, and you've been very patient and very grateful to you, but this is the last bit of questioning. And that concerns knife crime. You met, just as you came in, two of the parents of the victims of knife crime. We had, giving evidence to us last week, DAC Hitchcock, and we opened our newspapers today to find out that he's about to leave you and go to another job. This is a very short period for an anti-knife czar who's supposed to be fashioning a strategy for the government. Why has he only stayed 18 months?
Well, he's made very clear, and I think he's made clear in the comments he's made to the newspapers, that he will certainly want to see out the specific work on the Tackling Knives action programme. But I think the important thing to say about this work is that it's never, despite the very important contribution made by DAC Hitchcock, it's not been about one person. It has actually been about the combined work of the police forces, particularly in the 10 areas which have been part of the programme, their partners in local government and in the community, and the sort of, as well, of very brave and creditable initiatives that you yourselves have had the opportunity to hear about this morning. Particularly, I'm always impressed by those, of course, that are led by the families of people who have suffered terrible losses, but who nevertheless turn that tragedy into something positive in terms of trying to prevent that from happening again.
Is it also the case that even though he's retiring and therefore drawing a full pension, he's also going to be employed, and that there are a number of senior officers who who are receiving salaries of over £200,000 a year because they're drawing their pension having retired from one part of the police and then they're employed in another part of the police. Is that a practice that you support or have concerns about?
Well, it is, of course, the case that if you're retiring now with 30 years' service, you have access to your police pension. The government reformed, of course, the police pension system from, I think it was 2006. So anybody joining the police service now will actually need to serve 35 years before they get access to their pension, number one. Secondly, of course, what we tend to see is people starting a police career at a later age now than previously. But I have, of course, in the past, and I will continue to make the case for the appropriate use of public money when it comes to police pay and pensions.
Indeed.
And I haven't always, of course, had the support of this committee for doing that.
No, but we're very pleased that you had a settlement with the police this year. On the knife crime statistics, we questioned Mr. Hitchcock as to why he was not informed about the use of the statistics on knife crime, which, and to give you credit, Home Secretary, you did come before the House and gave us a mea culpa for having used those statistics without the quality checks. Why was he not informed about the publication of these statistics?
Well, as I think he made clear at the meeting, at the point at which that particular fact sheet was published, he was on holiday, and that's why he didn't see in that form those statistics. His deputy, who is working with us permanently in the Home Office, the ACPO, effectively secondee to the knife crime programme, did see them. And they had, of course, also been the subject of discussion in the weekly meetings that we have in the Home Office and with other departments on evaluating the progress of the knife crime programme. And, I think it is important to set in context those figures. I think it is very important that when you set in place a programme that is about dealing with an issue that is of considerable public concern, and where arguably, actually, the very fact that people believe that there is a high level of knife crime is part of the reason why they themselves feel that they have to arm themselves and go out on the streets with a knife. When you're facing that sort of concern, I think the public expect that where there is information that suitably explained, suitably caveated, it's made available to the public. Now, it was because we realised the importance of doing that, of course, that we set up a monitoring process specifically for the knife crime action programme that gained information from the police forces involved that isn't actually available in any other form of national statistics, and it was that management information that formed the vast majority of what was published as the fact sheet that went alongside the announcement.
What's happened to the person who decided to go against the advice or possibly the instructions of the national statistician about releasing those statistics?
Well, no, let's be clear about this. As I think is spelt out in a letter that Gus O'Donnell has sent to the Public Administration Committee.
And to us.
And copy to this committee. The national statistician's specific concerns about the one figure that I apologise to the House about weren't actually received until after the fact sheet was published. I have taken responsibility for saying that we were, I'm clear, too quick off the mark in publishing that figure that related to hospital admissions, and I've made that statement in the Chamber of the House of Commons, of course.
What has been put in place to stop it happening again?
Well, there are as Sir Gus spells out in his letter, first of all, there are a series of actions that have been taken across government in terms of advice to permanent secretaries with the not just with the UK Statistics Authority but also with the National Statistician. There are within each department a range of actions that have been taken to fulfil the requirements of the Statistics and Regulation Act, including within our department, for example, from last April, there being a new, more independent source of statistical advice, who has our chief statistician, who has a direct link to the national statistician, so that actually we are much clearer about the way in which we need to ensure both professional advice and transparency about statistics, and actually, just as an example of the way in which that is impacting, perhaps I could tell the committee that, particularly given the concerns that there were about the quality of data collection within the most serious violence category of the crime stats that we introduced in April 2008, following consultation with the Home Office Chief Statistician and the National Statistician, I've actually asked the Inspectorate of Constabulary to undertake an important quality assurance exercise to monitor the police recording and collection of data under that newly introduced category of most serious violence, to ensure it's being done in accordance with the Home Office counting rules. And we will also be following the advice confirmed by letter this morning from the National Statistician that in relation to the presentation and format of the quarterly crime statistics, which are of course due for publication on Thursday, and which, in line of course with the newly strengthened requirements with respect to government statistics, I have not seen yet and won't see until 24 hours before they're published, that actually we will, the National Statistician has advised me and my Chief Statistician that whilst that quality assurance exercise that I've put in place is underway, that actually we should not publish the data broken down in the way in which it was the last time that quarterly crime stats were published, not including that one subcategory of violent crime, but actually include all of the figures for violent crime, but break them down instead into the categories of violence with injury and violence without injury. So that is all of the violent, publication of statistics on all of the violent crime, but with one of the subcategories, which is the subject of the quality assurance work that I've put in place, not separately identified within that total.
And finally, has the UK Statistics Authority signed off all that you have put in place and approved that this will guarantee no future mishaps in relation to stats?
The role of the UK Statistics Authority is to act rather more as a sort of regulator. So it isn't the role of them, it wouldn't be appropriate, for example, for us to go to them to ask them to sign off everything that we were doing. I think that we're confident that we're fulfilling what has been put in place by this government as much more strengthened and robust conditions around official statistics, both through the legislation and through the new code of statistics. And therefore I hope that in its regulatory function, the UKSA will recognise that that's what we're doing.
Mr. Claps, sorry, could I ask, officer, could you ask them to be a little bit quieter outside? Yes.
Very good. And I appreciate you made a very full and proper apology on the floor of the House. But on this, it wasn't a question of the government going to the statisticians of the statistics as regulators, national statistician. They came to you because we're told in the letter, which you've referred to, from the chairman of the UK Statistics Authority, and I quote, "The statisticians who produced them, together with the national statistician, tried unsuccessfully to prevent their premature, irregular and selective release." Would you expect that were statisticians from the Statistics Authority to come to you again and say, please don't publish these statistics yet, or don't publish them in this form, that your department will take notice of what the Statistics Authority says to it?
Yes, of course they would. And I think that's very important in terms of the transparency and the strength of national statistics, although I do reiterate that I think there is a responsibility on government where monitoring information is being collected, where something is of significance to the public, to also bear in mind its responsibility to share that information with the public. I do note, of course, that there was quite considerable discussion over the Christmas break of a set of information gathered by the opposition party through a freedom of information requests to every single police force in this country, which was freely quoted from and published in various national newspapers. Fair play to them because they were given access to it, but about which there was no comment made about whether or not it had been through the appropriate checking arrangements or not. Now, of course, there is a greater responsibility on government in the publication of national statistics to make sure that those are appropriate, but I don't think, can we, that we can get into a situation where actually the only people that aren't able to comment on things of particular concern to the British public are government ministers because of concerns around the transparency and the validity of statistics.
But are you saying that Mr. Brokenshire's press release, which quoted the statistics from your department under the FOI, was wrong?
No, it didn't quote. Actually, it didn't quote statistics from our department because the statistics
so where
that
were
were
these
actually
statistics
from, it was a as I understand it, it was a freedom of information request to a variety of police forces. Of course, freedom of information requests quite often bring forward statistics before they've been through the checking process necessary in order for them to be national statistics, and those were statistics that actually have not been seen by ministers within the Home Office and won't be less than 24 hours before the publication of the official statistics on Thursday.
Oh. So we have to be on our guard.
We do. Margaret Moran, we'll ask the final question.
This committee is often railing about the lack of availability of current statistics on which to monitor whether we're creating legislation which is effective. And given that the statistics coming out on Thursday relate to first quarter 2008, for example, knife crime, surely it's important to have timely information as well as accurate. What more can be done to speed up the process so that people can have that confidence that the information they're getting is relevant to what's happening to their everyday lives?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you, and of course that was the point I was making. I think that, quite rightly, we as government will be held to account for delivering on things that are of concern to the public, and we will need to provide evidence that we think that we're doing that. And in the case of knife crime, as I said, there are actually even broader public policy reasons why it's important that people understand the true extent and the success, in my view, that the police and their partners are having in bringing it down. I think perhaps we need to distinguish between those things which are official national statistics and those things which I think quite legitimately are gathered as monitoring information, as management information, where of course there has to be provisos put around the status of those statistics, but where actually I think both policy development and public understanding is supported by that information being made available as quickly and as widely as possible, both to those involved in delivering the policy and to the public.
I think this is a dilemma that we should put back to the UK Statistics Authority, because not only is it responsible for ensuring valid, accurate statistics, but it also, I hope, will want to encourage the availability of information to Parliament and the public. And so there is a balance to strike here, and I think there's more discussion to be had with the authority.
Home Secretary, you've given evidence for an hour and 40 minutes. We're extremely grateful. We're very generous with your time. You've never refused our request to come here, which we're grateful for. And we will look forward to having you back again in the not too distant future. Thank you. And David, thank you very much indeed. Order, order.
Portcullis 2, line F 4 by 3, line M 16 by 9.